The story opens with a man reflecting on his past, recalling how he moved to a bustling city for work immediately after finishing his education. For the last 10 years, his daily routine has been defined by the exhausting experience of commuting on overcrowded trains. His role demanded relentless dedication, and as his responsibilities mounted, he began spending even more of his time at the office. With even his weekends rarely free, he gradually lost the passion for reading his favorite historical novels before bed. Feeling unfulfilled by his mundane daily life, the protagonist began to yearn for the peaceful beauty of the hometown he had left behind. Upon waking, he immediately sensed something was wrong. His hands were tiny, his body had shrunk, and he found himself peering out the window of a room he didn't recognize. Looking outside, he was met with a world that was completely foreign to him. A voice called out for Van as his maid Till rushed into the room, frantically warning him of the danger lurking just outside. Baffled, he asked for her identity, but he still couldn't quite grasp the situation. Admiring the stunning scenery, he noted that the garden's charm was what prompted him to move closer. They were left stunned by his advanced vocabulary and perfect pronunciation, which was especially shocking considering he was only 2 years old. Van was even more stunned to find that, despite being nearly 30 years old, he now inhabited the body of a toddler. Formerly a stressed salaryman in a cramped city apartment, he now found himself in an unfamiliar body with a personal maid, neither of which felt like his own. Uncertain whether he had died or been reincarnated, he was surprised to find that he still possessed memories belonging to this new life. He verified that she was indeed his personal maid, a fact she promptly confirmed. Additionally, he was aware that his name was Van Pharaoh. While boasting about his own wit, Till took the opportunity to name his family members: his father, Duke Pharaoh, and his older brothers, Mersha Yard and Sesto. Yet one crucial detail remained a mystery. He had no idea where he had ended up. The Pharaoh family gathered in the dining room and settled in for their meal. Serving as the head of the family is the father, Duke Pharaoh. While the 3 brothers, Mersha, Yard, and Sesto, shared a quiet meal, Van found himself completely surrounded by attending maids. He managed to charm those around him simply by eating his vegetables with impeccable manners. The experience felt strikingly familiar, reminding him of the special treatment he used to receive as a VIP at a hostess bar. Even after waking up in this new world, he still carried the memories of his former life in Japan. Despite the surreal and disorienting nature of his situation, he decided to adapt and make the best of it. His brother, Yard, appeared to be visibly unsettled. During their evening meal, Jalpa followed his usual routine of questioning his son's progress, asking Yard exactly what he had learned that day. Van questioned if this was the standard for noble life, where mornings were spent in idle distance before the boys transitioned into their daily swordsmanship and academic lessons. Jalpa then shifted the conversation, asking Sesto how his day had been. After listening to his explanation, turning to Van, he asked what his next move would be. Van responded cautiously, explaining that since he knew so little, he intended to study the nation's history and culture. A heavy silence settled over the room, leaving everyone, including you, completely speechless. Jalpa was initially too stunned to offer any kind of response. Jalpa let out a hearty laugh, filled with pride over his youngest son's intelligence, which remained sharp despite being pampered by his mother, Marara. Jalpa was convinced that Van had inherited his formidable fire magic, while Marara eagerly awaited the boy's 8th-year coming-of-age ceremony, a pivotal milestone in a world where discovering one's magical affinity is essential. While noble houses hold the 4 primary elements in high regard for their utility in combat and healing, those born with rare or unconventional talents are often met with nothing but contempt. While his father and brothers mastered the 4 primary elements, Van believed that any form of magic could be effective if applied creatively. The Pharaoh family stood as a prominent noble house, renowned for their military might within a nation dedicated to warfare. They took immense pride in their mastery of fire magic, which served as a formidable asset on the battlefield. While the world society mirrored the medieval and early modern periods, the existence of magic significantly simplified daily life. The potential spread of gunpowder threatened to destabilize the current order and create massive complications. Even though standard weapons like swords, spears, and bows were common, magic remained the ultimate deciding factor in combat. In a world comprised of 3 continents and numerous islands, Van resided in the Scuderia Kingdom, a vast nation situated in the southern region of the western GR continent. For 3 centuries, the ruling dynasty had steadily expanded its borders, a tradition the current king maintained by leading combat-trained nobles to seize territory from neighboring smaller nations. It appeared that Van's father had even been promoted from count to duke as a result. Van then questioned Hill about whether there was only a single port, reasoning that while narrow straits were challenging to navigate, they offered protection from the massive monsters lurking in the deep ocean. He clarifies that while races like elves, dwarves, and beastfolk exist, they typically keep to their own secluded territories, making encounters with them quite rare. The maids found Van's complex questions difficult to follow, and when one suggested he take a nap, he clarified that he was simply curious before asking if they were the ones feeling tired. They insisted that they were doing all right. Van pressed for more information on magic tools, leading Hill to explain that certain stones and crystals could store magical energy for crafting purposes. Having learned this, Van decided to hold off on his more pressing question about prodigies until a more suitable moment. Vesparta, a 49-year-old butler, approached Van to ask how much of his past he could recall. Despite being only 2 years old, Van had already developed a basic understanding of letters and numbers. Despite his years of skilled service to Van's father, Van had never actually spoken to Vesparta before. The pressure left him visibly nervous and sweating as he fumbled for a response, prompting Vesparta to ask once more what he could remember. Van encouraged them to ask their questions directly, as he hadn't yet learned how to write. Vesparta tested Van's basic math skills, and he successfully solved both the addition and subtraction problems she presented. Following a brief silence, Vesparta announced he would personally tutor Van twice a week, a prospect that felt like absolute torture to the young boy. The material far exceeded the grasp of a 2-year-old, and the sheer volume of information was simply overwhelming. Vesparta was astonished by the toddler's intellect, as Van had already mastered reading and writing while studying the complexities of the noble system and regional laws. Van often questioned what a typical 2-year-old's life was supposed to look like, as he had spent those first 2 years in a state of constant learning. Gripping a wooden stick, he practiced his sword skills, though the sparring session with Till in the tatami room felt more like simple playtime. One day, another maid grew frustrated after defeating Van and suggested that he should punish her. Although the plan sounded entertaining, Till grew uneasy knowing how serious these matters usually were, prompting Van to dismiss her concerns with a quick flick to the forehead. Despite only having 6 months of training, his daily dedication to the sword allowed him to spar with older apprentices by the age of 5. He frequently defeated these young warriors by landing the first blow with his stick, discovering a genuine passion for the craft. He blends techniques from martial arts like judo and karate into his swordsmanship to gain the upper hand against his opponents. Since his opponents were only children, their attacks remained predictable and repetitive, lacking the seasoned skill required to overcome someone like Van. In contrast to the atmosphere at his brother's estate in Chesto, Van frequently socialized with the commoners, who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. Deputy Chief D moved in to inspect Van's hands more thoroughly. He noticed that Van's skin was remarkably smooth, showing no signs of roughness, and that his nails had grown quite long. Van didn't understand why D was inspecting him so closely until D pointed out that his hands bore no marks of nightly training. Van quickly clarified that he hadn't been practicing at night because he was focused on his studies, only training with his sword when he had free time. D discovered that Vesparta had recently tripled Van's study requirements, finally explaining why his lessons had become so overwhelming. De Grue was thrilled, eager to personally take charge of Van's swordsmanship training. Recognizing Van's natural talent, he encouraged him to focus on swordsmanship and offered to tailor his training to match his specific physique. Brimming with pride, he was eager to mold Van into one of the kingdom's elite swordsmen. Observing their sincere gazes, Van explained his passion for both scholarship and swordsmanship, aiming to achieve mastery in both fields. Realizing she could not change his mind, D ultimately relented and agreed to his request. Van had requested a gentle touch, but he was instead pushed to the brink of exhaustion without a single moment of rest. Even when Van tried to take a break, D insisted he remain in a squatting position. Initially, he viewed D as cruel, but that single remark changed his perspective, leading him to dismiss the man as nothing more than a foolish brute. Upon his arrival, Till praised Van for his hard work. Though life had been challenging since his rebirth, Van found a daily happiness he had never experienced in his previous life. Finding the fulfillment he had long been missing, he now flourished as a member of a prestigious noble family. He resolved to enjoy every moment of this pleasant new life to the fullest. By the end of those 3 years, he had long been recognized by everyone as a true prodigy. Suddenly, an attacker swung his sword at Van, threatening to cut his fortunate life short once again. The narrative shifts back 2 years, focusing on Van when he was only 6 years old. He vividly recalled a day spent outside, remembering his home bustling with people who never seemed to age. Van Mew has spent 6 years in this world, yet he still carries the memories of his 30-year-long life on Earth. Reborn as the 4th son of a noble family, he is widely regarded as a natural genius. Despite his reputation, his daily sword training is incredibly grueling, feeling more like a form of torment. Despite being only 6 years old, Van already outclassed child soldiers twice his age, mastering new skills with the proficiency of a grown man. His loyal maid, Till, marveled at his natural talent with a blade, suggesting that his mastery could even allow him to surpass his brothers and lead the family. In a world where the strong dominated the weak, Van's journey took a different turn. Since absolute power belonged to the family head, he viewed the assassination attempts from his talented siblings as a routine part of climbing the noble hierarchy. Fortunately, Van shared no bond with his brothers, fully aware they would eliminate him without hesitation. He understood that whether he sought leadership or not, drawing too much attention was a death sentence, making his dream of a peaceful life feel like an impossible goal. Till's suggestion to play outside allowed him to step away from his life as a prodigy and finally enjoy being a normal kid. To begin, he chose to maintain a completely carefree persona. The journey began with a shopping trip before they visited the Murray Company, a massive enterprise with outlets spanning the entire kingdom. He continued his explanation until the sheer magnitude of the situation reminded him of the massive scale of a Costco. A man suddenly approached, shouting as he dragged along a child with bound hands. Van stared at the child's tattered clothing, feeling completely perplexed by the situation. Clinging to the rope, the man informed the onlookers that this was no mere act. He asserted complete authority over his child, claiming that the boy's debts left him with no choice but to sell him into slavery. While the law officially limits slavery to death row inmates and convicted criminals, history tells a darker story of impoverished families being forced to sell their starving children just to survive. The father revealed that he had used his own son to settle his outstanding debts, effectively turning him into a debt slave. Van realized why he was frozen in silence. Despite the grim sight, slavery was a normalized part of this world, and while he viewed it as a corrupt system, the people around him didn't even bat an eye. Upon spotting Van, a woman approached him to ask if he was indeed the king's son, the renowned prodigy. Introducing herself as Rosalie, she thanked him for visiting and welcomed him, confirming he was indeed the Van everyone had been discussing. She stayed by his side to keep him company, offering to bring him whatever he needed. Van inquired about the price of the young slave, while Rosalie, estimating the boy was roughly 8 years old, asked his father about his magical capabilities. Her father viewed the situation as theft, yet she estimated his value at a maximum of only 3 large silver coins. Frustrated, the father argued that slaves typically sold for at least 5 silver coins, insisting their longevity justified a higher price. Rosalie countered that shops typically purchase for less than half the retail value, arguing the boy was only worth 3 coins since his small frame made him less practical than women once maintenance costs were considered. As the father's anger boiled over, Van stepped in and urged him to show his son some compassion if he truly valued their family bond. His father sternly instructed Van to remain silent and stay out of matters that didn't concern him. An irritated Rosalie called the father a fool and argued against buying the boy, questioning if the man would actually follow through with the sale after lying to his own son. The father insisted that he had been deceived by everyone and adamantly refused to sell to her. He pulled his son along, leading him toward another shop. Noticing the boy's pained expression, Van suddenly stopped the group and offered 5 silver coins to buy him. He remained calm, realizing that the child's life depended on his immediate intervention. The father demanded the money, but Till explained that she only possessed gold coins. He reportedly instructed her to swap them while inside, promising that he would handle the rest of the situation himself. Rosalie settled the payment with the father while Van checked on the boy, asking if he was all right and able to stand. After introducing himself as Van, he learned that the boy's name was Kaman. Van explained that he wasn't at liberty to go anywhere. While Till questioned if he had been purchased as a slave, Van's only goal was to rescue him. Despite Till's concerns about his father's reach, Van felt that leaving the inexperienced Kaman alone on the road was far too risky, as he couldn't bring himself to abandon him. Van inquired if Kaman had a place to stay, and after a brief silence, Kaman asked to join his household, offering to help with chores in exchange. A young boy cautioned Van, explaining that the king only allowed unfamiliar children into the mansion if they were enslaved. Van sought Kaman's agreement, and Kaman responded with a silent nod of confirmation. Van suggested they start by picking out new clothes to look more coordinated, but Rosalie pointed out that a slaying contract was the priority, taking Kaman's hand as a mark began to form. The unique slave contract mark remains permanent unless the seal is broken. In her capacity as a contract magician, she decided to waive the fee for Van's initial visit. His expression of gratitude caught Rosalie by surprise, as she wasn't accustomed to such kindness from nobility. Yet she continued to lead them forward with care. Rosalie suggested that Van pick out some clothes for Kaman, prompting Van to take him by the hand and invite him along for the shopping trip. The sudden request caught him slightly off guard. Van led him to a high-end section of the shop, but he was caught off guard by the unusual texture of the clothes he selected. Rosalie clarified that the garments were made of high-quality material, then pointed out a different set of clothes typically reserved for slaves. Van quickly clarified his perspective, insisting the chosen outfit suited Kaman well perfectly, and mentioned he also needed to pick up shoes and other essentials. Rosalie agreed, noting several pairs that would complement the look, while Van reflected on the fact that this was his very first time venturing out. After acquiring a slave, he felt certain that his life would finally proceed smoothly. Van soon approached him, warning that Deputy Commander D was searching for him and offered a cookie in exchange for claiming he wasn't around. Despite his suspicion that the commander might already be aware, Kaman went ahead and ate the cookie anyway. Van noticed that Kaman wasn't wearing any gloves, but when he pointed it out, Kaman dismissed the need for them, leaving Van to wonder if he was truly comfortable with the attention his bare hands drew from others. While Kan argued that the mark was a testament to their bond and deserved to be seen, Van disagreed, feeling it wasn't something meant for public display. After purchasing a pair of gloves for him, Kaman put them on immediately, and promised Van Heyd he would wear them since they were a gift. Reporting back to Deputy Commander D, Kaman revealed that Van was nowhere to be found, which came as a shock since witnesses had clearly seen him enter a room earlier. Kaman then suggested that the commander's deep attachment to Van might have caused him to see an illusion. Deputy Commander D shouted at Cameron, demanding to know how he still had food in his mouth when none was supposed to be left. He accused Kaman of having the audacity to ignore the Deputy Commander's orders, to which Kaman responded by stating he belonged only to Van as a slave. The Deputy Commander acknowledged Kaman's newfound courage and ordered him to take Van's place, noting that he should be honored to receive personal training from the commander. Listening in from the shadows, Van couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for Kaman. Reflecting on Kaman's lazy nature, he reasoned that there must be some benefit to falling from a genius to an ordinary child, deciding that if Kaman ever quit, he would step in to take his place as he watched him and Deputy Commander D walk away. The focus then shifts to Van's 8th birthday, the day of his official magic appraisal ceremony. Everyone was eager to see the results, as his reputation for being a remarkable talent had already set expectations high. Given that the Pharaoh's sons all possessed magic tied to the elements of fire and wind, the family was confident that Van would also manifest fire magic too. However, during the ceremony it was revealed that Van lacked any elemental affinity, possessing the rare power of creation magic instead. Practitioners of alchemy were widely regarded as the most unfortunate magic users, as their craft required gathering raw materials like iron and copper to visualize and forge items like swords or jewelry, a process that heavily depleted their mana and restricted what they could produce. Crafting weapons and trinkets through magic wasn't a unique feat, as those with different abilities could achieve the same results, and traditional inventors or blacksmiths didn't even require magical skills for their work. Van remained safe from his brothers and the family's power struggles, having spent 2 years intentionally lowering his status, though his low rank did nothing to change his inherent magic type. While the nobility held the 4 elements in high regard, the Pharaoh family placed a special emphasis on those gifted with powerful fire or healing magic. As the eldest son and deputy to the family head, Mira worked harder than anyone else. Yet his younger brothers still looked down on him, believing their fire magic was superior to his wind magic. Within the ranks of the nobility, magic was regarded as a highly prestigious asset. Jalpa was stunned to discover his son possessed creation magic, a sharp departure from the powerful fire magic both he and his wife wielded. Despite her immense magical power, Van's mother passed away shortly after his birth, leaving Jalpa with massive expectations for the boy's potential. Unsheathing his blade, Jalpa noted that Van had always displayed strange abilities, admitting he was a fool for ever expecting much from the boy. Consequently, he declared that the Duke's family would no longer be restrained. Determined to protect his secret, he insisted that Van would have to be eliminated to ensure total silence. Van stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. But Mira, the eldest son, quickly moved to shield him just as Yard arrived to ask what was happening. Mira explained that he oversaw a pristine section of the Duke's territory, which included a remote village in that area. He suggested granting Van control over that specific region. Land Merrigan served as the site of his ascension to Duke, as well as the location where Count Ferdinand, whose own territory had recently diminished, dispatched his knights to face judgment. Entrusting the village to Van wouldn't cause any friction, even with a knight positioned near Count Ferdinand. Furthermore, since the newly acquired land still held loyalty to the Duke's house, placing a family member there, even symbolically, would help stabilize the region. Approving of the plan, Yard decided that Van would remain in the village to serve as its lord. He instructed him to set out as soon as his preparations were complete. He commended Mara for proving his worth before finally taking his leave. Immediately afterward, Marin knelt before Van and offered her apologies. It pained him to watch his younger brother struggle with creation magic, especially since Fant had already endured years of mistreatment from their father and siblings over his weak abilities. He was even prepared to accept Fant's resentment if it meant suggesting a path that might finally help him, no matter how difficult the challenge. Van harbored no ill will toward him, as Mira had been the one to step in and save his life. Otherwise, Van faced the grim prospect of death or capture, likely resulting in him being silenced and sold into slavery. In this critical moment, he resolved not to let the opening Mira provided go to waste. Mira was consistently impressed by Van's sharp intellect and sophisticated vocabulary, noting that Van analyzed situations with far more depth than he did, while Esparta took great pride in reporting Van's many successes from the very beginning. The Duke's family decided to dispatch Van to a remote location, fully aware of the challenges that awaited him there. Van remained fully committed to giving his absolute best, and Mara supported the decision as long as it proved advantageous for him. After a firm handshake, Van expressed his sincere gratitude to his brother. Upon returning home, a furious Till argued that despite his lack of magic, Van remained a brilliant and well-respected noble. While she found the decision to send him to a remote village absurd, the status of a feudal lord still held significant appeal, and despite the silence order, Van reached out to her to express his gratitude and his surprising enthusiasm for this new life. Reflecting on the stark contrast between a commoner's life and the rigid rules of nobility, Van realized he was finally free. Assuming the responsibilities of a feudal lord in such a quiet village would likely afford him plenty of leisure time, leaving him to wonder how he should spend it. Driven by the lingering pain of his family's abandonment, he resolved to turn the village into a peaceful haven, where he could finally live a fulfilling life. While the nobles deliver grand speeches to bolster their pride, their true focus remains on self-preservation, even if it means abandoning the safety of the kingdom and its people. It's a common reality that the nobility looks down on ordinary citizens, reserving a particular level of disdain for those who live as adventurers. The group is seen debating the specifics of their mission to protect a noble's child. Since collaborating with royalty was out of the question, they were forced to accept the situation. When the largest among them questioned his decision, he simply admitted that he had no other choice. Van made a friendly entrance and introduced himself with a warm smile, leaving Ordo, the group's apparent leader, struck by his charm as he returned the greeting. Van began praising Ordo, clearly impressed by the sheer size of his hefty weapon. The other members of the adventuring party looked at Van with a mixture of curiosity and genuine amazement. Van bid the group a friendly farewell before departing, leaving a pleasant and lasting impression behind. While they found him endearing and saw him as just another innocent youth to protect, Ordo warned them not to get too familiar by ruffling his hair. Meanwhile, Van and Kaman were busy making final preparations for their upcoming travels. He directed his belongings to be loaded onto 3 horse carriages. Since military wagons weren't available for this escort, Mera had hired adventurers for protection instead. While they originally planned to provide only 1 carriage, Mera had insisted on a larger convoy. Till joined the party as well, remaining dedicated to serving Van wherever his journey led. Although only a few were aware of his rare magic beyond the 4 primary elements, rumors were inevitably starting to circulate. He joined the party as well, swearing to cut down anyone who dared to stand in Van's way. He inquired about securing a knight army escort, but since D was uncertain, he urged the group to finish their preparations more quickly. Esparta arrived and pointed out that it was still too early for Jalpa, though he soon took his leave. With his children now fully grown, he saw no reason not to join Van in the countryside for some rest. Esparta had served alongside his father for years, making it difficult to part ways or find another aide who could match his unwavering loyalty. Even in retirement, Esparta continued to oversee Van's education. Van felt a surge of anxiety seeing how heavily everyone had packed, as if they were preparing for a journey far beyond a simple village, yet he remained deeply grateful for their support. While the others provided much-needed energy, Esparta offered his vast wisdom to the group. Noticing Van's peculiar smile, Till asked him if something was wrong. With a sincere smile, Van thanked the group and expressed how happy he was that they had all arrived. Till explained that while many other maids hoped to join them, she was the only one who managed to persuade Mira after pleading for the opportunity. She explained that Mera was usually too busy to interact with the maids, and while Yard and Sesto treated the staff poorly, Van was a notable exception. He made it a habit to greet them every day, sharing his snacks and helping out whenever they needed to clean. The mage who practiced swordsmanship also held a deep admiration for Van. Feeling a bit bashful, Van informed Kaman that he was welcome to stay in the kingdom if he was unhappy, noting that the deal with Slade could be modified or cancelled with Miro's quick approval. Cameron pledged his lifelong loyalty to Van, prompting a flustered Van to jokingly ask if he was really that fond of him. However, Cameron spoke with complete sincerity, expressing both his genuine fondness and admiration for him. As the moment of departure arrived, Van sensed that his father wanted him to disappear quietly, as if trying to erase any trace of his existence. After spending 2 years in the town, it had finally become deserted. Just as the group prepared to depart, a young girl rushed over to get Van's attention. He recognized her as a guard's daughter he had encountered on a few occasions. However, when she asked about his travel plans, he found himself wondering where she had heard such a thing. Following her gesture, Van noticed a man trailing behind them with several horses. Van found the situation mortifying as the soldier explained that per D's orders they didn't want him to leave in secret like a fugitive. They insisted on a proper farewell instead, noting that while D was currently resting in the carriage, he would be alerted as soon as the woman had been eliminated. Jolting back to consciousness, he shouted that Van, the kingdom's fourth prince, was present. He ordered the way to be cleared, promising to personally handle any officials who came looking for authorization. A crowd gathered around Van to see him off, urging him to return soon while speculating if he was heading to the royal capital for his studies. He bid them farewell, surprised by the genuine concern they showed for him. Meanwhile, Gruter was overcome with emotion and began to sob. A man approached Van to inform him that the beef barbecue was ready. Van noted their journey would take them through 2 cities. But first, they stopped to set up their very first camp. He recalled living in a car in his past life, though this was his first time camping in a world teeming with monsters. To ensure his safety on the journey, he commissioned 2 teams of adventurers led by a burly veteran with over 20 years of experience. He was skilled at handling his clients, including an 8-year-old named Levin, who he found to be a surprisingly firm communicator. Van expressed his appreciation for the meal and Ortho's hospitality, suggesting that he take some time to rest. Tell noted that Van's generosity was evident enough for even the adventurers to recognize. She envisioned a life with Van as her master, certain they would have shared countless more wonderful conversations. He reflected that after leaving the town and passing through 2 cities, he wouldn't be able to repeat the journey. Reflecting on their journey, he noted they still had 4 cities of varying sizes to visit, with a full day of rest planned at each stop, though their heavy luggage was significantly slowing their pace. Over the past 2 weeks, they had covered 50 to 100 kilometers daily, totaling nearly 1,000 kilometers so far. The kingdom was massive, and while he couldn't be certain of the exact distance, he estimated it was like traversing 3 or 4 prefectures back in Japan. Till announced their imminent arrival at the village, prompting Van to liken the situation to a manager stepping into a new workplace where first impressions are everything. While Van was lost in thought, the carriage suddenly came to a halt at the city gates. When he asked for an explanation, the driver, gripping the reins, urgently informed him that the village was under attack. The adventurers soon gathered in a circle, debating their next move as they worked to devise a strategy. Speculation arose that the threat could be bandits or fleeing mercenaries, leading one person to offer a retreat for the fearful while another braced himself for the coming battle. The village was fortified with thick wooden walls, rendering any incoming arrows practically ineffective. Armored soldiers and a group of magicians stood guard at the gate while the terrified villagers urged Van to let them join the fight, certain that their teamwork would ensure victory. Van estimated they were facing 40 to 50 enemies, yet he questioned whether they should rush into battle without first understanding the true nature of their opponents. Arthur Sheet deemed the mission far too dangerous, and while Dee acknowledged the risk of injury or death, he remained confident the group could handle it. Arthur explained that he follows a strict code, refusing any job that requires the sacrifice of teenagers. He then noted that, as an experienced adventurer, Dee must have faced these kinds of difficult choices many times before. Arthur countered that they would have met their end long ago if simply risking their lives was enough to kill them. Dee challenged the group to see if anyone was willing to risk their lives, declaring that the village and its inhabitants now served as his lord's first domain. In the face of this crisis, he instinctively drew his blade. Ortho acknowledged that Dee was a capable knight, but maintained that his affairs didn't concern them. He argued that no amount of extra pay was worth losing his life, though he did admit a personal interest in protecting Van. Ultimately, he suggested they might still provide an escort depending on how the situation developed. Bard rejected the idea, noting that Dee was someone who would willingly sacrifice himself for the sake of others. He insisted that Dee was capable of taking on 30 enemies, including mages, in what he considered a fair fight. Bard argued that if Dee were to fall now, the village would lose its leader and their resolve to fight, even if Bard himself were the first to perish. As previously noted, he remained a mage capable of wielding 4 elements. He noted that the open terrain would reveal their true combat potential, leaving Ortha surprised by his fighting ability as he cautioned the group against taking any unnecessary risks. He would initiate this strategy by raising a barrier wall, allowing the adventurers to launch ranged attacks from safety. By drawing the enemy's attention and repeating these surprise strikes, he aimed to steadily improve their chances of victory. Ortho questioned whether magic could be blocked, skeptical that anything other than arrows could be stopped. Van explained that the cart was reinforced with iron at strategic points, allowing them to safely retreat after an initial surprise strike, noting that their primary goal was simply to catch the enemy off guard. He questioned whether Esparta would stay behind to face the threat, and Esparta agreed to act as the decoy, realizing that if he didn't provide cover from behind the wall, D and the others wouldn't make it out alive. Van felt uneasy about Sparta's suggestion, sensing it would lead to disaster, while Sparta argued that he and the elderly man would be more effective allies. He urged Van to let him face the danger himself instead of having Van act as the bait. All eyes turned toward Van as the group waited expectantly for his final decision. Till stepped forward to block Van, firmly rejecting his proposal and insisting that she face the enemies herself, confident that her victory would be guaranteed if they targeted her. Kaman spoke up, announcing that he would be joining them as well. Van once again called for the group's undivided attention. He then stepped forward and asserted his authority as the leader of the group. He agreed to let Ortho and his team escort him to the village while he considered his options, though he clarified that this didn't mean he would fight for them. He then told Usparta, a retired noble servant, that after everything he had done for Van's family, he shouldn't have to die there. He explained that D and the Nike squads were loyal to his father rather than himself, noting that he would owe his father an apology if any of them were harmed. Looking at Till, he admitted that he saw her as an older sister who had stayed by his side longer than anyone else, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing someone so important to him. Turning toward Kaman, he expressed his respect for the man's honesty, assuring him that despite being a slave, he wasn't required to sacrifice his life. He followed up by expressing how glad he was that Kaman was enjoying his life. Labeled as useless and cast out by his noble family, he was humbled that anyone would choose to follow him. Determined not to be a leader who merely barked orders from safety, he offered a sincere apology to his comrades and resolved to lead the charge from the front lines. Van took the lead, announcing that he would push the cart forward, while the others flanked the enemy with long-range attacks. He insisted that if the enemy refused to retreat, they should escape and leave him behind. He understood that as long as his identity remained a secret, the duchy wouldn't care if he fell to bandits, giving Ortho the confidence to proceed with the risk. Van dismissed Ortho as a mere child, questioning his claims of having risked his life for the sake of duty. Orth warned that any further talk of that nature would force him to discipline the entire group. Paul explained that she had been deceived by nobles in the past and only knew them for their arrogance, yet Van was able to recall each of their names individually. She explained that this was exactly why they were willing to risk their lives, and the rest of the group voiced their agreement. Meanwhile, Van realized the only reason Puyol's name had stuck in his memory was because of her cute appearance, claiming to be the proud knights of the Pharaoh family. They served Van, the man destined to shape their future, as he vowed to protect Van and secure the family's legacy. Aspartist expressed his hope that, once the exile concluded, Van would finally return to his noble responsibilities and duties. He assured Van that the entire matter would be settled within 3 days. Van felt the process was dragging on, so he adjusted the terrain and executed his strategy, first erecting a barrier to strike from a distance. D and his knights prepared to strike from the left flank while Ortho and his crew closed in from the right, leaving the non-combatants on standby for any emergencies. Once the details were settled and everyone was in agreement, the group began executing their plan. With the wall established, D and his knights prepared to move forward alongside Ortho's squad. Ortho realized that the old butler was far more than a mere servant. He was a proficient 4-element mage capable of holding his own in combat, though he still wondered about the true extent of the man's power. Ortho reflected that defying the young master's orders back then could have cost him his life, noting that a noble of his worth was far too precious to die so young. Ortho remarked that he wished the boy could be a lord, confessing that the events of the last 2 weeks had completely reshaped his perspective on the noble class. It was surprising to find such a person in the family, and Ortho still expressed a deep curiosity about Van, even promising to rush to his aid in a crisis despite barely knowing him. As the lord of a small village, he refused to retreat, risking his life to protect everyone under his care, from the knights and servants to the slaves, by utilizing his experience as an adventurer to craft a plan that ensured no lives were lost. Despite being only 8 years old, Van was willing to risk his life for his own sake. Ortho considered Van a peculiar child, but upon his return, Kaman immediately embraced him with a prayer of relief. Ken decided that should Van ever find himself in danger, he would prioritize protecting him before following him wherever he went. Van viewed them as his real family, explaining the situation and asking them to intervene if they were capable of helping. He instructed them to retrieve the medical supplies and first aid kits from the cart. Paul clarified that they would only intervene if the situation became truly dangerous. With a collective shout of acknowledgement, they charged back into the heat of battle. The bandits' composure quickly began to crumble. With neighboring towns and villages already in ruins, the assault on this small settlement was nearing its end. However, as the bandits discussed their next move, an arrow flew from behind a wall and struck one of them. As their strikes landed at the exact same moment, Ortho found himself genuinely impressed by Dee's combat prowess. The effortless way he handled the massive sword put his immense strength on full display. This explained his position as the Pharaoh family's deputy knight commander. Panic set in among the enemies as they attempted to flee, but Ortho pursued them until he noticed one heading toward his allies. He shouted for his team to stop the runner, but the ranged unit's view was obstructed by the wall. He shouted a warning about the approaching enemy, but his alert came just a moment too late. The young man was forced to confront the massive enemy. She needed her magic, but the 10-second recharge time proved to be a delay she couldn't overcome. Just as she accepted her fate, Vannon arrived and rushed to her rescue. She cautioned them that this was no opponent for children. Yet they ignored her warning and launched an attack. After enduring a barrage of heavy strikes, the opponent finally collapsed. Van warned that more enemies might strike and instructed them to guard the front, leaving Paul to wonder about the boys' strange behavior. While a few bandits managed to escape, the rest of the attacking force was completely neutralized without any casualties, resulting in a perfect victory. Ortho stated that the task would be completed as long as they received half of the client's fee. Valuing more than just money, he asked if he could stay there for a little while longer. While the rest of the group moved on to their next assignment in a different region, a few members chose to stay behind and remain by his side. The nearby forests and rugged peaks offered a prime hunting ground, allowing him to slay demons for profit without the need for official quests. Paul observed that Van didn't fit the typical image of a noble, which was exactly why Ortho wanted to stay and see what kind of man the boy would eventually become. Van's sharp intellect was remarkable, surpassing even the high standards of a typical noble's education. While he initially looked the part of a young aristocrat, that formal impression vanished the moment he spoke. He was polite and kind, possessing the warmth of a spirited child. Despite his high-born roots, he never showed a hint of arrogance toward commoners, leading Ortho to admit he had never met a noble like him, a sentiment the rest of the crew silently shared. They recalled Van's earlier admission that his magic wasn't meant for battle, realizing he had been fully prepared to sacrifice his life for them, a selfless choice rarely seen among the nobility. Poole realized that Van had intervened to save her, noting that his actions weren't those of a child but instead reflected the experience of a seasoned knight from countless battles. Despite being under 10 years old, the boy was a complete enigma who far outclassed every noble they had ever encountered. Ortho was eager to see how the territory would thrive under Van's leadership, and he asked his crew if they also wanted to stay and witness the land's transformation. With the group in full agreement, Till began badgering Van, insisting that Cameron be given the lead for their next mission. Cannon focused on devising new strategies to further enhance his strength, but Pulse soon stepped forward and apologized for the interruption. She teased him for already breaking hearts at his age, but Van replied that he intended to be completely sincere with her because she was someone he truly valued. Noticing that the children's physical development didn't align with their actual age, Paul began to wonder if he might be an elf. She remained conflicted on how to address him, as his informal demeanor stood in stark contrast to his noble status. Van explained that since Till had raised him from infancy, he simply assumed he was human, prompting her to ask where he had mastered his sword skills. Nodding toward Dee, he explained that despite not being fully grown, he had been personally trained to surpass his own limits. She questioned if his keen intellect and quick wit were developed in Sparta, and Van confirmed that they were. Paul remarked that she owed her survival entirely to Van's bravery and his prowess with a sword. She expressed her sincere gratitude, promising never to forget the favor, while Van simply grinned and insisted it was no trouble at all. Paul was concerned that if the problem was rooted in his noble charm, it would only lead to further complications. In this instance, however, one adventurer had successfully secured the loyalty of another. Sparta informed Van that the villagers were gathering at the gate, and since this was his first meeting with them, Van was determined to make a lasting impression. A crowd of villagers soon gathered, and Van stepped forward to present himself to everyone. He announced that he had been sent by Lord Pharaoh, the region's new ruler, to take over the administration of their village moving forward. Rhonda, the village elder, approached him to express her sincere gratitude for saving their community and its people. Van cited past examples of local leaders and soldiers who had defied orders, declaring his intent to protect the village by taking command. He requested their cooperation, and though Ortha found his approach a bit too formal, she kept her thoughts to herself. As a show of hospitality, Rhonda invited him inside and mentioned that the village had a population of 150 just 6 months prior. A month after the initial bandit attack reduced their numbers to just 100, the village faced its third raid, leading Van to question why they had become such a frequent target. He suggested the issue stemmed from the Gen Kingdom border, noting that while Earl Ferdinand's knights once maintained active patrols, the area had fallen into neglect under the new lord's rule. The village began to endure significant hardship after falling under the authority of Lord Pharaoh. Van explained that while Count Ferdinand had allies in every town, his father, Lord Pharaoh, only prioritized major cities, leaving the smaller villages neglected and their futures uncertain. Because the village was so small and peaceful, it required no protection and paid almost nothing in taxes. He then committed to keeping them informed from that point forward. Complaining, mourning, or blaming the kingdom was ultimately pointless since their doubts changed nothing, and Rhonda Galaga's son appeared furious following Van's address. Van told him to sit, speaking on behalf of the village while privately worrying that their future looked grim with such an impulsive person in charge. Van realized that King Berlin, the kingdom's founder, might have left behind a significant legal loophole. Silence followed his statement until an onlooker cleared his throat, prompting him to continue. Though Van felt a flicker of anxiety, he remained dedicated to his leadership, understanding that complaining about the kingdom's laws would do nothing to change the reality they faced. He then laid out 3 clear steps for the plan. Their first step was to craft an item so significant that the kingdom would be forced to take notice. Second, they planned to generate enough wealth to hire a steady supply of mercenaries. Finally, they would take it upon themselves to restore and expand the village. A local woman explained that they had already considered those options, but their isolation made implementation difficult. Selling raw materials wasn't profitable, and their lack of formal training made it hard to produce valuable crafts. Consequently, they would find it incredibly difficult to earn a living. Van acknowledged the hardships the villagers had endured, promising that he would use his education to protect and revitalize their home. Disappointed by the reaction, he quickly spoke up to explain that he had been entrusted with managing land since he was only 8 years old. His natural talent earned him a reputation as a prodigy, and Dee soon interjected, stating that his knight leader had come to serve them faithfully and wished to join their group. Touched and impressed by their words, the villagers asked Van if he possessed the 4 elements. However, he stopped them short, explaining that he lacked any combat abilities and shouldn't be relied upon in a fight. Fortifying the walls became their main objective to ensure no outsiders could breach the perimeter. While the wooden fence was built sturdily, it remained highly vulnerable to fire. Asparta explained that while magic could keep the stones solid, they would eventually revert to ordinary dirt. Van instructed him to use the stones to reinforce the defensive walls. He felt confident that they would soon finish constructing a sturdy barrier. He suggested that a moat would provide extra protection against bandits and volunteered to handle the construction himself. He instructed the others to lay traps and prepare their counterattacks from atop the wall. They opted for simpler weapons like bows, arrows, or even stones, which would be much easier for the villagers to manage. Stepping forward, Van revealed his vision to the community and pledged his full commitment to the village's future prosperity. He explained that despite his youth, he had the support to withstand any enemy, realizing by the end of his speech that he sounded just like a politician. One man spoke up to ask about the taxes, noting that they already surrendered 30% of their crops, monster hides, and teeth. He then lowered the rate to 10%, promising to personally cover any remaining shortfall. His proposal left his villagers stunned as he emphasized the importance of a stable life, pointing out that some had even been forced to sell their children to settle debts, while others lived in constant fear of the bandits' inevitable return. He explained that sending a message would take 2 weeks, far too late for any aid to arrive, and the villagers were furious at the realization that they were being abandoned. Van understood their frustration, but explained that the Marquis lacked the funds to hire knights for such a vast territory, noting that even if they could recruit some, they would need at least 200 men to be effective. He asked the group to move aside and promptly raised a stone wall behind the wooden fence without a moment's delay. The villagers were left stunned, as he emphasized that their assistance was now more critical than ever before. With their combined efforts, the village would manage to survive. Due to a shortage of housing, they were forced to sleep in their wagon, as they weren't yet willing to displace Rhonda despite his offer to host them. He never voiced any complaints about only possessing production magic. Haunted by his lack of combat prowess, he attempted to earn their favor, but they remained cold and unimpressed. To ensure the village's prosperity and secure a peaceful future, he first needed to earn their trust. He made a solemn vow to protect the village and transform it into a thriving home for its people. Van, Asparta, and Rhonda gathered to discuss their strategy, where Van proposed a preemptive strike using magic bows from the walls, though Asparta voiced concerns that the low height would limit their impact. Rhonda countered by recalling a time they used spears through the openings of a forest fortress, suggesting that since the enemy is now in a comparable position, they could successfully employ the same spear-thrusting tactic once more. When Van mentioned the term catapult, Rhonda found herself completely unfamiliar with the word. However, Sparta clarified that the weapon was designed specifically for sieges, making it ill-suited for their current defensive needs. He informed Rhonda that while the machine launches massive boulders with unpredictable accuracy and a slow reload time, it remains powerful enough to demolish large structures like fortress walls and lookout towers. He suggested using crates of small stones to extend their range and targeting the gate to maximize the impact, while also proposing the use of oil and torches to ignite the ground for a more devastating assault. Intrigued by the idea, Sparta requested the opportunity to develop the device herself. It was revealed to be Van, though the others still harbored doubts regarding his production magic. Even he didn't fully understand his own situation at the time. After heading to the countryside to master the manipulation of stone, wood, and metal, he finally puts his refined skills on display. Van then turned to Ortho, asking if they could seize the village now that the rival group had retreated. Ortho accepted the proposal, deciding to stay behind for a while to earn some extra coin by hunting legendary beasts. He paused, sensing the presence of monsters nearby. Warning Van of the potential dangers, he suggested they rest by the nearby trees, while Van marveled at Ortho's uncanny ability to spot and crush hidden enemies as they traveled. Despite his natural talent, he found himself unable to level up, right as Kin's attention was drawn to a massive tree. Van realized the tree was far too massive to chop down, and after finding another that was equally oversized, he decided it was time to put his abilities to the test. His inability to visualize the object clearly caused his magic to manifest as something distorted and weak, proving that production magic is far from easy to master. As he focused on a small fragment, he felt he could mold it to his will, sensing a warm energy travel from his core to his fingertips. The visualization required absolute precision, forcing him to picture every detail down to the individual fibers of the trees. Should he succeed, the strands would intertwine into a solid bond, a feat confirmed only when the fibers fractured and seamlessly merged back together. The group was suddenly transformed into wooden figures. Although it appeared to be wood, the material was actually a flexible, plastic-like substance. The fiber blocks proved to be remarkably durable, even surpassing treated wood in strength, so they made plans to produce them in bulk. They decided to refine the materials once they returned to the coach, but Poole soon approached to ask if the wood gathering was complete. Lighter and tougher than anticipated, the material resisted any damage, prompting Van to urge him to test its durability by trying to break it. Ortho hammered away at the block, landing one strike after another. However, it remained perfectly intact, without even a single crack appearing. Van pondered whether the rock or this wood was more durable, thrilled to have finally found something so practical. Upon reaching the carriage, he realized his magical energy had been completely depleted. Most importantly, he understood that magic was governed by complex rules, yet he still took great pride in the fine craftsmanship of his creations. While still deciphering the mechanics of magic, Van realized he had to visualize every detail of a weapon, from its metallic composition to its sharp edges and overall form. After finishing the sword, he handed the weapon over to Kaman. He found the object so peculiar that he vowed to pass it down as a family treasure. He also forged an axe for Till, but after catching her expression, he began to wonder if she actually disliked the weapon. Exhausted from the grueling effort of crafting an indestructible axe, he finally collapsed to the ground. Till reassured him of her deep affection for axes, even going so far as to pull him into a warm embrace. Van appeared satisfied that she liked his work, but secretly sensing her true feelings, he resolved to craft her jewelry next time while wondering if pushing his magic further would increase his overall power. He devised a unique way to apply his magic, leading Ortho to praise his skills and rank him as a top-tier mage alongside Van. This comparison flattered Van, who felt a sense of equality with him, though Paul found it strange that someone with such talent hadn't joined the military or become a high-ranking adventurer. Van felt a deep sense of gratitude that Sparta remained by his side even as retirement approached, valuing his companion's future just as much as their shared history. Thinking of him with genuine affection, he sincerely hoped the man would enjoy his later years. Sparta approached to inform them of his growth, noting that as a lord, he must now uphold the duties associated with his title. Growing anxious, Van insisted they prioritize reinforcing the village's defenses and promised to strengthen the gates, prompting Sparta to stop and ask exactly how he intended to pull it off. Stepping forward, they offered to help with stacking the stones. Noticing the confusion surrounding the sudden tremors, he clarified that the rumbling was actually caused by his magic. Realizing his mistake, Dee expressed his respect for Van, while the others warned that magic alone wouldn't be enough to succeed. Since the gate was made of wood, Van decided to manipulate it using the same techniques he applied to his usual wooden blocks. His primary concern was the weight, as it was essential for effectively holding back enemies. Recognizing their current limitations, they planned to construct a massive metal gate next. With a moment of intense focus, he summoned a massive gate that left the onlookers in disbelief. He instructed Ortho to strike the object to test its durability, noting its ability to self-repair, which prompted Ortho to deliver a powerful full-force blow with his blade. The blow landed with a heavy and decisive impact. The strike left only a faint mark, and while Van sensed something was off, the others were quick to dismiss his concerns. The next morning, he woke up feeling stiff and irritable after another night confined to a cramped sleeping bag. With no way to properly wash up, he was reminded of the long journey where camps, wagons, and even the carriage in the village had served as his only bed. Outside, Till and Enin met up with him, finding him physically unharmed, yet clearly troubled by something. Exhaustion had finally overtaken Tail and his companions, making it clear that they had reached their absolute limit. Before they could focus on the village's defense, they first needed to secure food, clothing, and shelter, prompting him to begin work on a house. As he instructed Kaman to gather the wooden blocks, Rhonda approached and asked for an explanation of the situation. Van inquired about the safety and suitability of the location for his new home, and Rhonda assured him that the village center was the perfect spot for his mansion. Van toyed with the idea of organizing a festival during their leisure time, though he initially questioned whether he could build anything more sophisticated than a basic house. He constructed 4 support beams and carefully adjusted their dimensions. He visualized the layout like wire on the ground, planning for thick support posts before moving on to the floors, walls, and eventually the roof. Although he had a clear vision of the layout, the actual scale of the build felt much larger than he had anticipated. He moved on to the interior walls next, using every remaining block to finish a house that included a kitchen, a bathroom, and several bedrooms of varying sizes. He made sure to include the smallest rooms, knowing that leaving them out would surely upset Sparta. After finishing the installation of the window shutters, he realized he still needed to ask the traders about acquiring quartz sand. The house was fully built and quite roomy, though Sparta didn't personally consider it particularly large. While he felt the house was a bit small, it was easily the most impressive home in the village, leaving everyone in awe of Van's unique craftsmanship. Despite the utility of his magic, he still believed that combat-oriented spells were superior, feeling that a lord should serve as a reliable shield for his people. Till argued that she preferred the city's environment over Jelpa's domain, and Aspart agreed, noting that while combat is essential during war, people truly desire a leader who improves their quality of life during times of peace. In his eyes, there was simply no one more suited for the task than Van. Upon their arrival, Dee was particularly struck with disbelief, unable to comprehend how a house could be constructed so rapidly through magic. He mentioned that with a larger supply of timber, he would be able to build homes for everyone. Dee instructed his crew to gather food, utilizing wagons to transport the supplies. Van was impressed, having never seen such a fast-paced operation before. Even Ortha shared the enthusiasm for the new house, offering to help by chopping wood. He urged them to keep up the momentum. He urged the group not to let the knights outshine them, though Van remained puzzled as to why someone from a rural area like Ortha would even need such a facility. Before long, Rhonda arrived with the villagers, explaining that Van was capable of constructing houses. Just as Van had anticipated, the housing complaints didn't stop with a single person, making him regret ever sharing the news with Dee. However, the dilapidated state of their homes was plain to see. He finally relented, instructing them to form a line for their new homes. Determined to use his magic to lift their spirits, he set to work as the village mobilized. While Espa and the locals reinforced the barricades, he joined Mr. Orr to gather timber, and Van led Till and Kaman in the construction of new houses. He had grown accustomed to his power, becoming highly efficient at managing these types of builds. He insisted on designing the interiors himself, feeling that following a preset plan was no different than taking orders. The task filled him with a sense of melancholy, as it reminded him of his grueling days as a corporate slave, yet he found it impossible to stop once he had begun. Meanwhile, Dee continued to be amazed by Van's immense magical capacity, noting that constructing such a grand mansion required significant expertise. The residences were organized into 4 distinct clusters, with the streets and alleys following a grid layout known as a block. To maintain a sense of fairness, the commoners' houses were all constructed with an identical design. Although these structures were sufficient for the moment, he intended to customize each home once he acquired proper building stone. Filled with gratitude, the villagers bowed and presented him with offerings every time he passed by. He also constructed a modest bathhouse near the mansion, and while he initially built it for his own use, he was pleased to see others enjoying it as well. Utilizing her magic, Pool purified the water and then heated it over a traditional fire. Pool eventually invited Van to join them for a bath. He became visibly flustered, finding it awkward to be treated like a young child when he was mentally a man in his 20s. After washing up alone, he returned to his empty room, where the sight of the sleeping bags only added to the dreary atmosphere. He quickly fashioned simple bedding for everyone, making resourceful use of the local hay and straw. He rested peacefully in his cozy bed, feeling completely content. After a restorative sleep, he woke up to enjoy a delicious breakfast alongside Till. Sharing a meal and laughing freely in his own home felt wonderful, yet Asada reminded Van that they still required a steady income. At the moment, merchants deliver goods only once a month, serving as their sole connection to the outside world, while Asada maintains a stern demeanor despite the bits of omelet clinging to his mustache. He preferred not to discuss the matter during breakfast, feeling increasingly frustrated with Asada. Asserting his ability to manage their housing, furnishings, and clothing needs, he noted they had plenty of resources and decided to focus on reinforcing their defenses. Asada pointed out a shortage of spices, noting they were also missing the ingredients required for Van's favorite sweets. Frustrated by the situation, Van decided to craft something for profit and sought suggestions on what he should make. Kamson suggested utilizing Van's wooden blocks, but the idea was dismissed since Van was the only one capable of producing them. Till then proposed hunting monsters for materials, but Van rejected this as well, noting that Otto's crew already kept their hauls for themselves rather than sharing with the village. Asada suggested selling crops as a solution, but the village's unique circumstances made it a slow and difficult way to earn quick money. Searching for the most effective path forward, Zara became convinced that Van was truly infatuated. He had already instructed them to proceed with the test to see how it would play out. He took care of the trap removal, but cautioned that they were far from safe. Fearing they might compromise Van's special talent, Zara stepped in to reassure them after noticing Kamson's anxious expression. Zara showcased a piece of oak reinforced with leather along the interior and edges, making it remarkably durable. He instructed Kaman to deliver a strike, but the resulting blow lacked any real force. He was on the verge of demanding that he strike with even more force. Suddenly, the oak snapped in two as easily as paper, leaving the onlookers in complete disbelief. Zara's eyes welled with tears, devastated that his fresh oak had been ruined. He was visibly surprised to find it was only a wooden weapon, but the man told him to take it, promising to make it far more powerful than before. He followed through and did exactly that. Alternatively, he could simply show up and ask what they were doing. Upon spotting the van, he wondered if they could sell it. He explained that this deep forest was teeming with powerful evil spirits tied to the Wolf's Mountains, though rare minerals could still be harvested without needing to scale the peaks. The collection featured iron, silver, copper, and gold, along with the highly valuable mithril ore. Van was thrilled by the find, realizing how lucky they were to have stumbled upon these items in the forest. Ordo struck upon an idea, realizing that the remote location and rugged terrain had made mining difficult, especially since previous efforts focused solely on nitrips while neglecting potential herbs and minerals. Van noted that this was the perfect opportunity for skilled miners to begin their work, reasoning that if the foothills were already so rich, the Wolfsburg Mountains were bound to hold even greater wealth. He began by processing the iron ore. While magic usually spreads evenly through wood, it seeped into the ore at inconsistent speeds. The sections that reacted too quickly were broken down into sand. This left only a third of the original material to be used for quality testing. Because he was unsure of the ore's initial purity, it still required melting and further refinement. Zara eagerly inquired if Van could forge a weapon from the material, noting that even a slender, double-edged sword would suffice. This raised the question of whether he truly loved swords specifically, or if he simply had a fascination with iron weapons in general. Van explained that because Zara had secured the ore, he would craft weapons for the entire party, prompting an excited Zara to request a dagger and a long sword while expressing her gratitude. With focused intent, he began shaping his first iron weapon, crafting a blade thicker than a katana, but with a razor-sharp edge. Taking the metal's density into account, he quickly assembled and secured the pieces until, moments later, he held the finished sword in his hands. The speed of his work wasn't due to shortcuts, but rather a clear testament to how much his skills had evolved. He handed the weapon to Zara, who cheered with joy as the others crowded around to see it, while Van ignored the noise to focus on crafting a longer version in the same style. His efforts proved successful, resulting in the creation of a sharp and resilient blade. He handed the item to Zara, shifting the focus to the specialized gear she carried. It wasn't long before the other adventurers began clamoring for Van to craft weapons for them as well. Paul noted that while it was difficult to assess their true value without a proper test, the items would likely command a significant price. Finding such a deposit in the forest rather than the mountains was a rare discovery, as iron sand was much more common, and the actual ore within these rocks appeared to be exceptionally scarce. Expecting to find common deposits of stone or iron, they speculated that a nearby dungeon might be the cause, as an ordinary crew had never encountered such a phenomenon. Zara wondered if these were the remains of golems that had been destroyed long ago. He also tried to find out if there were any dungeons in the vicinity, but no one had any information yet. Since the surrounding area hadn't been scouted yet, the possibility of a dungeon remained. Discovering one would revolutionize their trade and bring a massive surge of business to the village. Van smiled faintly, pleased by the idea that the village would benefit from any dungeon he might discover. Dungeons served as the primary source for the nation's weapons, gems, and relics, making these resource-rich locations vital to the country. Because of their importance, guild regulations required adventurers to report any new discoveries, allowing the organization to establish a local branch in the nearest town. For any adventurer, discovering a new dungeon is a massive breakthrough that can instantly solidify their reputation. Such a find could even catapult them into the elite ranks, granting them the exclusive privilege of being the first to explore its depths. He realized that if the village reported the dungeon now, they likely wouldn't be able to afford the guild's high service fees. He concurred, warning that adventurers, traders, and knights would soon flood the area, even though food and supplies were already in short supply. They faced the looming threat of an invasion from the neighboring country of Ferdinand, while also weighing the risk of searching for the dungeon, which could lead to their expulsion. Furthermore, Poole warned that as soon as word of a dungeon spread, the area would be swarmed by knights. With Van's magic making quick work of any construction needs, he explained his precarious position as an outcast within his own family. Knowing they would eliminate him if given the chance, he insisted on developing the village before claiming the dungeon, ensuring they would be powerful enough to keep his relatives from interfering. Ordo directed the group to scout the potential dungeon site while gathering resources. Deciding that while claiming it now wasn't profitable, Van remained hopeful for a future payoff. Dungeons were of immense strategic importance to both the kingdom and the nobility. His family dismissed him as a failure with no place in their future, despite the belief that a dungeon could change his status. For the time being, however, that opportunity was handed to one of his brothers. To maintain his hold over the village, he was forced to rely on his specialized skills. While walking with Till, Van noted that housing was finally settled, leaving funding and defense as their next priorities. When Till asked if his magic was holding up, Van admitted he was reaching his limit. Fatigue quickly rendered him ineffective, even though they were in desperate need of more laborers. With so few locals possessing the necessary crafting skills, he worked to ensure the stockpile of weapons and shields was ready before the merchant's arrival. Defense was just as vital, and as the outer wall neared completion, he reinforced the stones to be as solid as concrete. Once he corrected the initial lack of height and mass, he mounted a simple ballista crafted from leather parts along the top. Equipped with a massive front shield, it allowed them to launch heavy bolts while remaining protected from enemy fire. After fortifying the village perimeter with ballista-equipped towers, Till left to prepare dinner, prompting Van to offer his thanks to Kansas. Realizing he had sent the wrong thing, he followed up with a question to clarify. Campson claimed he had only brought stones, yet he proceeded to reshape the village with seamless precision. While he appeared to still be mastering Van's abilities, Van explained that as the Lord, his primary responsibility was to ensure the prosperity of the village. He inquired whether Campson harbored any personal dreams. Campson focused his efforts on guarding the van. Van deeply valued Campson's sincere loyalty and honesty, though he gently cautioned him not to overexert himself. He decided that his next task would be crafting a set of armor, as he felt his loyal knight deserved the best protection possible for the dangers ahead. He spent 3 days working tirelessly before finally turning around. After transforming the village into a mini stronghold, he felt the result was ideal, noting that it felt less like a simple settlement and more like a compact fortress where bandits stood no chance of sneaking past the walls. They pondered the potential consequences should Jalpa ever witness the full extent of Master Van's power. It was clear the family prioritized combat prowess above all else, but he remained firm in his belief that Vance's unique talents were viable for battle and would one day allow him to surpass everyone. As the confrontation escalated, Van intervened, pointing out that dwelling on regrets or innate talents was useless. He argued that true progress came from adapting to one's circumstances, sharing a few bits of wisdom he'd gathered along the way. They appeared to be enjoying themselves, prompting Dee to chuckle and nod in agreement with Van's words. With the lighting setting the mood, they prepared to get to work. Although the freshly excavated trenches were still dry, they offered solid protection and a clean layout, though he remained mindful that securing drinking water was just as vital. They focused on reinforcing the base and sides of the ditches while establishing a clear path for the water supply. For now, they relied on river water and filtered rain, though he was already considering how to secure a more permanent supply. A sudden noise from behind signaled that a group of bandits had arrived. As the group approached from the opposite side, Van ordered the bridge to be raised and the gate to be sealed. After inquiring if anyone was still left outside, he dispatched someone to investigate. As he remained in position, they followed his orders without hesitation, even though the prospect of combat still unnerved them. This felt like their final confrontation, and though he felt a flicker of fear, his duty as Lord forced him to remain composed as he acknowledged the grim reality that casualties were inevitable. Recognizing that the village's future depended on this battle, he stood his ground but admitted he couldn't succeed without their help. Van's encouraging words resonated deeply with the group, causing their fear to finally subside. Van began issuing his orders before preparing to head out. She clutched him tightly, and noticing her tearful expression, he spoke to her. He instructed Dee to gather his crew and scout the enemy's movements. Exuding confidence, Dee assured Van that he could be relied upon. He was widely regarded as a brilliant leader and a genius, maintaining his excellence even when the odds were stacked against him. Dee remained certain of Van's victory, especially since he had already taken pride in surpassing Commander Stradle before pledging his loyalty to Van. He placed his absolute trust in him, remaining fully prepared to sacrifice his life. After assessing the area, his subordinate reported that the groups were likely bandits and warned that they were heading straight for them. Van reported that they were only a few hundred yards away, advising the group to prepare their defenses while questioning if anyone might be trailing them. While they deliberated on their next move, someone caught sight of a tail, signaling that armored dragons were already charging toward them. To make matters worse, even seasoned knights find it difficult to contend with armored drydans. The village lacked seasoned fighters, and as the dragons seemed to be leading the bandits straight toward them, they realized their standard weapons were useless against the creature's armor. Although his spell was successful, only Spada and the adventurer's daughter remained in any condition to continue the fight as mages. The adventurers had ventured off independently to secure supplies. While a seasoned knight might be able to stall a dragon and target its vulnerabilities even without a mage, the villagers were far from capable of such a feat. They were quickly overwhelmed by the creature's devastating tail and claw attacks. He then ordered everyone to take their positions at the ballistas and ensure a steady supply of bolts was within reach. They urged everyone to follow Van's instructions as the villagers fled from the dragons, crying out for help. The relentless assault proved difficult to repel even within a large town. He estimated there were roughly 40 armored dragons, each 8 meters long, and suggested using the bandits as lures. The veteran pitied them and requested another option, which amused Dee. After apologizing, Dee explained that he laughs in the face of danger to ease the tension, believing that a solution will always emerge during a crisis. He directed them to focus on the dragons and open fire as soon as the bandits reached the moat, while Van questioned if the enemy could reach him from that distance. They noted that targeting the eyes or mouths would improve their odds, leading to a bold declaration that everyone would survive the battle and emerge victorious. He boasted that Dragon barbecue would be on the menu for dinner that evening. Moments later, a group of bandits began charging toward the village. Paralyzed by fear of the pursuing dragons, they felt the tension mount as the beasts drew near. As he prepared his crew, he carefully concealed the fact that he knew just how grim their situation truly was. He signaled the catapult crew to begin their assault. Arrows took flight, but he appeared insignificant against the overwhelming scale of the dragons. While other efforts proved useless, Van's custom arrows successfully pierced through their tough hides. A single strike shattered a dragon's paw and pinned the creature down. While the casualties were minimal, the sheer force of the attack left them in total shock. Van asked for an explanation, and although Dee claimed to have accomplished something extraordinary, Van couldn't quite wrap his head around it. He explained that they had successfully taken down 10 dragons with a single strike. They reported that they had run out of arrows and needed to retrieve more from the spare ballistas. Van proposed using wood as a substitute if the iron supply ran out. Dee passed down the orders and prepared his troops for the coming clash. After the initial volley, a wave of confidence swept through the ranks, making victory feel inevitable. Their next shots were bound to be even more precise. With the watchtower crews finally in position, the defense was fully set. Dee was now completely certain that their victory was guaranteed. He ordered a volley of arrows to put the village's strength on full display. Reagan's roar of agony echoed throughout the area as wooden arrows, though less effective than iron, managed to pierce through his thick scales. He instructed them to continue using their wooden arrows, directing them to take aim and fire. After several rounds of combat, the last of the dragons finally fell, marking a hard-won victory. Eliminating 40 dragons with a mere 60 arrows was a feat beyond Commander Stradall's comprehension, and he beamed with pride for Van. He approached a visibly thrilled Van, who was so stunned by his first dragon sighting that he mistakenly called them dinosaurs. Left bewildered by the term, he suddenly erupted with joy, steering the van around in a triumphant celebration. Van observed the group gathered outside the gate and noted that 30 people had managed to survive. He ordered them to be bound and warned them to comply. Terrified, the bandits went so far as to offer themselves as slaves, pleading for any kind of work. Rhonda explained that this group had frequently raided the village, leading the vengeful residents to attack them in retaliation for the families they had lost. Swan suddenly caught his fist, determined to stop him from stooping to their level. He promised that the culprits would face proper judgment, urging the others not to stoop to the same level of cruelty. Addressing the bandits, he warned that their punishment was inevitable, and they would be taken into custody once help arrived. In the meantime, he assigned them the task of harvesting magic cores from the dragon carcasses. Arthur marveled at the past week's events, certain that these incredible memories would stay with him forever. Zara was just as impressed by the superior quality of the weapons. Although only 30 people were capable of wielding the specialized flawless swords, they could only process 4 or 5 bodies a day, making timing critical. To ensure the materials remained fresh, Ortho decided to begin the work the following morning. While Doris's team, Kaman's squad, and the Free People handled the remains, Van upgraded the cleaning knives with superior materials to make them significantly sharper. The group concluded their business over the next 3 days, and by that night, they were finally finished. Van delivered a speech thanking the villagers for their dedication, announcing that with their financial burdens finally lifted, they were free to enjoy any spices he prepared. He hosted a grand feast for everyone, though he cautioned them to limit themselves to only 2 drinks each. Van savored the dragon meat, finding it perfectly crisp on the outside while remaining tender and juicy on the inside. Ortho observed that the dragon's high-quality meat was protected by a resilient shell, explaining both the creature's immense market value and the necessity for ballista bolts powerful enough to pierce them. Dee accidentally overheard the conversation and felt a deep sense of disappointment at not receiving a sword, especially as he watched the other adventurers celebrate their new weapons. Dee and his crew crowded around Van, eagerly pleading for a supply of swords and daggers. Despite being showered with gratitude and endless offers of food, Van remained remarkably modest. His refusal to change his methods despite the difficult road ahead made the villagers view him as an oddity. Dee had nearly lunged at the bandits responsible for his family's death, but he ultimately thanked Van for restraining him, vowing instead to improve the village in their memory. Rhonda and his assistant thoroughly enjoyed the feast, while a woman expressed her joy that everyone could come together despite the presence of the aristocrats. Asada cautioned her against viewing the world through the lens of an aristocrat, yet that was precisely what she found so appealing about Van. Till gazed at Van, sensing that he was destined to achieve even greater things in the near future. Afterward, Ortho and Van deliberated on selling the dragons, with Ortho mentioning that a single shell dragon could fetch 20 gold coins from merchants, since much of the meat had spoiled and become unsellable. They estimated a profit of 8 coins per carcass after transportation. With 30 bodies in total, their earnings would exceed 300 coins. After a quick mental calculation, he realized the value was well over 300 million yen. Espat commended Van's defensive performance, while Van expressed his gratitude for the protective barrier Espat had provided. Asada pointed out that despite their success, a law required any village earning over 100 gold coins to pay a 50% tax to the Marquis' treasury. After disclosing the village's riches, Hispat noted that concealing such wealth would be a challenge, but remained possible, shortly before he departed from Van Stund. In all his years, he had never seen anyone as devoted to the Marquis as Espada. Yet here he was, proposing a scheme to deceive his own father. Unlike the situation in the dungeon, they were now moving to bury the truth in secret, directly betraying his father. Seeking a peaceful resolution that wouldn't involve his son, Van asked to hear the details of his plan. He declared that he would report the incident to his older brother, Mira. They acknowledged him as the one responsible for the dragons. With knighthood no longer an option, he turned his attention to Hessen, while a group of adventurers claimed to have eliminated a herd they discovered in the forest. Meanwhile, Vance's 3 older brothers were locked in a fierce power struggle for the family headship, casting him aside as they vied for influence. Determined to see his loyal supporter Mercia succeed, Van devised a clever strategy on the spot and announced it to the group. The following morning, the villagers greeted Van with high praise. He reached out and took Till's hand, and while she was initially startled, she felt relieved that her affection was finally being acknowledged. Despite his mature demeanor during the bath, Van was still only 8 years old and didn't hesitate to take advantage of his status as a child. He eventually released her hand to maintain his dignity, and though the thought of her leaving one day troubled him, he chose to prioritize her happiness instead. Van attempted to bring up the topic of Till's future partner, only for her to quickly interrupt him. She expressed her desire to stay and look after him, never even considering anyone else. Upon reaching the gate, Mr. Bell and Lango joined the merchants in asking the guards if they had witnessed anything unusual. While Van could only make out their silhouettes in the gloom, the guard managed to identify them. Taking no chances, Van ordered the bridge rays and ballast to be readied despite the complaints, while the merchants maintained they were not bandits. Wary that bandits might be lurking near the wagon or that the village held hidden dangers, Van refused to take any risks and sent Kin to fetch Ortho. With a heavy workload ahead, their success rested entirely on Ortho's efficiency. The moment Van had been anticipating had finally arrived. Elsewhere, a group of merchants found themselves stranded after their wagon broke down, resulting in significant damage to their cargo. From inside the carriage, a man ordered the driver to calculate the total expenses for repairs, lodging, and convoy fees. Despite arriving at Hashimura, their profits remained meager, leading the bald merchant to double-check if they were in the right place. Observing that the area looked nothing like a village, he questioned if they had lost their way, yet he remained certain they were in the right place. Interrupting their debate, Van greeted the group from the gate and introduced himself as the village lord, Vani Furto. He requested that any traders provide their company names and that escorts state their specific roles. The merchants grew uneasy at the mention of his name, as those from the capital recognized him and confirmed that it was indeed the man they had heard of. The driver was taken aback by Van's youth. While he understood that geniuses were often treated as outcasts, he found it hard to believe the Marquis himself had exiled the boy to the border. The group introduced themselves as Mary Bell, a merchant, her brother Lingo, who served as both a merchant and a guard, and an adventurer named Air. Van inquired if Ordo recognized them, to which Ordo confirmed they had previously met and shared drinks at the Ventures Guild. Van granted them entry into the village, greeting the group with sincere hospitality. Rhonda and the others welcomed Bell and Lengo back, who apologized for their extended absence and expressed relief that everyone was safe, just as Van arrived to offer his own apologies and reintroduce himself. He inquired if they were interested in purchasing dragon shell fragments, causing both brothers to light up with excitement since most adventurers avoided such dangerous prey, making these materials a rare commodity. Overwhelmed with joy, the group followed closely as Van led them toward the warehouse. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by a massive 23-meter stack of armored dragon materials. Bell and Lango stood in disbelief as Ven detailed their victory over 40 shell dragons and the capture of 30 prisoners, whom he intended to use for transporting their supplies. He shared that the wagon was finally repaired, leading Dell to conclude they needed to contact the traders immediately. They requested a month to settle the matter, and Van readily agreed, feeling no need to rush while there was delicious meat to be enjoyed. Realizing the meat would spoil before they could finish it, the villagers asked Van if they could sell the surplus to a nearby settlement and reimburse him, though Van doubted whether their neighbors could actually afford such a purchase. Dell explained them the area was impoverished, likely left penniless by this year's taxes and struggling with a lack of food. He proposed giving away some of the meat for free to lend them a hand. Van approved of the plan and agreed to donate it, having noticed that Bell didn't prioritize profit despite being a merchant, an observation that left Bell thoroughly impressed by Van's sharp insight. Bell offered to pay for the bandits as well, and while the profit margin was thin, it was still a welcome source of income. Van expressed his gratitude and invited him to return, promising an excellent deal for his next visit. Equipped with high-grade armor, he was bound to leave them stunned once again. He requested to bring along a blacksmith, a skilled draftsman, and a carpenter, offering a charming smile as he did so. He presented the armor he had crafted, leaving the group in awe. Though Bell didn't fully understand the technicalities of the gear, the display itself was undeniably impressive. Ordo provided a piece of dragon skin for a test, which was sliced through with ease. The guards were impressed and eager to make a purchase, and while they marveled at Van's incredible inventory, they admitted they couldn't take too much at once. Vance wasn't worried, assuring them that they could always purchase more later. While guiding them through the village, Van highlighted the progress of his latest projects. He then served them a meal prepared from the savory dragon meat. Bell inquired if merchants arrived monthly, and proposed doubling that frequency with the trade group's assistance. Van noted their need for more supplies and sake, observing how a single hearty meal had already lifted the villagers' spirits. Additionally, he requested that they begin promoting their weapons to attract more business. He suspected the brothers were aiming for an exclusive arrangement, a prospect he found quite favorable. He explained that by following this route and selling weapons together, the two traders would eventually reach his village. Van then suggested they create advertisements to boost their sales and profits, a proposal that immediately caught the brothers' interest. He recommended stopping by a shop in the village. They noted that securing a conversation with the enterprise owner or any local traders would be the ideal outcome. Bell and Lango were thrilled by the prospect of a stable income and their very own storefront, even considering building a house for the group if the proposal was accepted. Since the shop would facilitate trade with various merchants, it would mark the village's first commercial hub, a clear victory for both sides, as Bell began giving Lango his next instructions. Before departing, they pitched the idea to their boss, promising that he would continue working at the shop until the situation improved. They shared a firm handshake, officially solidifying their successful arrangement. Van also arranged for a letter to be sent to his brother, Mersha, providing a full account of his successes near the village gate. He established a shop specifically for Bell to use. Sweating and nearly moved to tears, he explained that the building featured a shop on the ground floor, living quarters upstairs, and a basement for storage. He had followed Bell's instructions as closely as possible, and while Bell already trusted Van's craftsmanship, he hadn't expected to end up with such incredible power at his disposal. With a 2-week deadline set for the goods, they finalized their business at Bell's shop and departed for the river, though the long trek eventually left Van completely exhausted. He urged the group to continue forward while Kaman took the lead to clear their path. While Van truly intended to be kind and considerate toward everyone, he struggled to match the exhausting pace set by Kaman's relentless energy. An hour-long journey from the village eventually led them to a scenic river, which served as their primary spot for gathering water. With their plans finalized, they began the construction of the water system. Harnessing his magic, Espa tunneled dozens of meters deep in just a few moments. As he took a break, D, Kin, and the others continued the manual excavation while Van followed behind to reinforce the walls. Espa's magical prowess was truly remarkable. Despite being nearly 40, they continued to work relentlessly until someone finally noted how grueling the task had become. Despite the village's distance from the river, securing water remained vital for their survival. The labor was grueling, yet he found the sense of teamwork toward a common goal to be deeply rewarding. Beyond the barrier, a spirit of joy grew from their shared efforts. He believed that improving their living conditions would eventually attract merchants and visitors, fulfilling his vision for a comfortable life there. In just 8 hours, the village appeared on the horizon, completing a journey that normally would have taken an entire week. Van decided to call it a day, much to the surprise of Espa and D, who knew they could have finished the task with just a few more hours of work. Van gestured toward Abulu and Kaman, pointing them out. Virgin D eventually took notice of them, and while he considered the experience to be good training, he ultimately agreed with their perspective. The latent strength of the veterans and senior crew members was truly imposing. By mid-morning the following day, they arrived at the village, catching the locals off guard as they prepared to begin channeling the water. Van commended their impressive work as they released the current, letting the water rush in with a serene grace. The villagers and children erupted in cheers as water finally reached their village. Rhonda was satisfied with the efficiency, though the water still required filtering and boiling before it was safe to drink. Lou arrived, his curiosity piqued by the tool he intended to craft. When Van offered to help with the construction, Lou eagerly accepted the assistance. Together, they built a filtration system near the village canals using layers of branches, sand, and cloth, ensuring a steady supply of clean water flowed into a metal container. Opening the tap situated beneath the tank would channel the water into the boiler. Standing by a fire magic crystal, Lou asked Bell if he had stocked any more of them, while Ken reported that the area was completely flooded with water. Van was satisfied with the way things had unfolded. Still, he couldn't shake his worries regarding a potential flood. The heavy rainfall had already caused the water levels to rise significantly. Espa was impressed by Van's keen observation and explained how they had strategically widened the channels and reinforced flood-prone areas, ensuring the water remained perfectly contained. Van weighed his options for managing the surplus water, considering whether to divert it back to the river or create a lake behind the village. While Espoil preferred the river, he acknowledged that a reservoir would be a vital asset during the dry season when the water levels dropped. When Van asked about adequate flood protection, Espa suggested utilizing a lake 200 meters behind the village, leaving them only 3 days to complete the urgent project before the rains arrived. As the lake neared completion, Van considered adding a spillway or a similar feature, though he still needed to determine its practical purpose. In that moment, he was simply a joyful child, thrilled by the sudden abundance of water. Waking well before dawn, Van found himself overcome by a sudden sense of anxiety and irritability. They arrived to find Rhonda and many others in a state of frenzy. while Dee and Espa had already departed for Lake Van. Van was unaware of the history behind the lake's name until Till revealed it had actually been named in his honor. He sought to commemorate his hard work, but the village now carried an unsettling atmosphere that made him feel as though something was wrong. Their discussion was interrupted when a frantic villager rushed in, desperately urging him to follow. Van and Till hurried toward the lake, apparently taking a back road to reach their destination. A concerned crowd had already formed in the village, prompting Van to ask about the situation. They gestured toward the lake, where a mysterious silhouette appeared to be staring back at them from the water. Deep within the thick forest bordering the river, a legendary being with vibrant blue hair resided. These beings were known as Abalu, a rare hybrid of human and mermaid. Since Van was unfamiliar with the species, Espa explained how difficult they were to find before identifying the girl as one, prompting Van to ask for her name. She offered no response, appearing visibly confused by the situation. He instructed Till and Kin to gather meat and fruit, reasoning that sharing a meal was the best way to begin building a connection. As the girl drew closer, everyone around her came to a sudden standstill. Taking a quick sniff of the meal, she asked if she could have it. Van's sudden reaction inadvertently frightened her, causing her to bolt away as he called out an apology. She returned with a supply of meat and fruit, which she then proceeded to eat. After tasting the dragon meat, she scowled and inquired about who had been responsible for hunting it. D. Ortho and the rest of the group gave Van the credit he deserved. Ultimately, it was revealed to be the work of the ballast. Upon hearing his response, she swam away and vanished, leaving the group frozen in disbelief. The following morning, Till burst into Van's room, loudly calling out his name. She explained that reports of an attack from the villagers had already plunged the area into chaos. Startled awake by the news of an attack, Van quickly dressed as Till informed him that the enemy had seized the water channel. He hadn't expected them to advance so far, but he remained confident that the ballisters would drive them back. Having his rest abruptly cut short, however, left him in a noticeably foul mood. Stepping outside, he noticed a crowd of ghouls staring intently at him. While he was just a child yesterday, he has already undergone a startling transformation. Despite their youthful appearance, the group consisted of adults of various ages, and the most senior among them requested a word with Van. Visibly anxious, the man called out to D. Ortho and Espa, asking them to join him. Bell was also present, noting that rare Abalobrat items were highly valued by traders and that pursuing them was a strategic move. Ready for a closer look? Van allowed the man to accompany him, and as they drew closer, the man expressed his daughter's gratitude toward him. He had heard reports of the boy defeating a dragon, and observing him now, the rumors seemed to be true. The surrounding Algolus watched in awe, questioning if he was actually a powerful mage while also taking note of the formidable companions at his side. Commending the man's boldness, he gave his formal approval for Van and Oprah to be wed. After a tense silence, he finally voiced his shock, leaving everyone behind him completely stunned. His mind was flooded with confusion as he struggled to understand who Alpriora was and why marriage was even being discussed. Oprior's father, Ovesta, made a request, but he was ultimately rejected. When asked about her whereabouts, it turned out she was simply out playing with her friends. Van questioned how long the marriage had been planned, pointing out that she was still a child. But Ovesta explained that their race was unique and had no prior experience with humans. After dragons seized their river and killed many of their kin, the tribe sought a powerful mate to ensure Alpriora's protection. Van realized they were prioritizing security over affection, much like nobles who use marriage to forge political alliances. Despite their reasoning, Van maintained that she should only marry someone she truly loved. They then firmly proclaimed their commitment to guarding the Algalu without the need for marriage. Vesta announced that they would stay with their son-in-law and travel across the water. Van clarified that he didn't own the property and suggested moving to the lakeside bridges to avoid alarming any visiting guests or traders. He quickly picked up on the fact that Vesta was calling him her son-in-law. He tried to clarify that he hadn't consented to the marriage, but the group was already on the move, and Priora had already begun calling him her husband. Esper pointed out how lucky Van was to have formed a bond with the Abdallah. They joked about Van's first wife being quite the catch, eventually agreeing that it was fine as long as it was his choice. Despite his attempts to refuse, the husband's protests ultimately fell flat. While the Abda enjoyed their time by the water, Van contemplated his responsibilities as the lake's owner. To complete his preparations, he constructed 2 sturdy shelters with walls and roofs to serve as resting areas. They were able to relax together in safety, and while Van was pleased to see them enjoying themselves, Espa was surprised to learn that these massive buildings were called skyscrapers. Espa was left astonished by the sheer depth of Van's knowledge, which had remained hidden until now. As the villagers bonded with Agalu over shared meals, word of the laboratory's ore shipments began to spread, prompting Van to further secure their growing community by constructing another wall. Now reinforced and large enough to encircle the lake, the structure significantly improved the safety of the entire village. Espa proposed planning for a city of 10,000 to stay ahead of their growth. While Van was surprised by the scale, Espa explained that since a larger wall would require too many guards, they should focus on housing a large population within a more compact area. Van considered whether a setup of 1,000 or 2,000 would be the more effective choice. Espa pushed back, arguing that the significant time commitment was a critical factor they couldn't ignore, and his stubbornness was so apparent that even his father found himself unable to object. Espo detailed the expansion, explaining that each 600-meter section would house defenses, residential areas, and guild bases. While full wall construction would require more manpower later, they could start with a flexible perimeter for now, noting the strategic advantages of a non-square city layout. He noted that while mages often target specific weak points, a square city layout is the simplest to defend, much like a star-shaped fortress. These triangular sections are designed to detach from the wall upon a breach, preventing any access to the city roads and making it unnecessary to clear the corners before heading for the core. Even when enemies bypassed defenses to launch three-sided assaults on the walls, this tactical layout, originally designed for firearm combat on Earth, proved remarkably effective in this realm of swords and magic. Espa explained that while a frontal assault concentrates force, the corner strikes are unable to spread outward, making a high number of troops essential to the strategy. He claimed the formation was incredibly solid, noting that even skilled mages would be unable to protect infantry caught in its path. In the middle of their conversation, an unexpected visitor suddenly barged into the room. A messenger sent by Count Ferdinand soon arrived. The message displayed more than just Ferdinand's personal emblem. He also held the unicorn and shield belonging to Viscount K.N., a rising noble from the Ferdinand circle that controlled the city, and he realized the man would likely want his belongings back. A girl and a woman stood at the gate, appearing completely unimpressed by the rumors of the young prodigy. Meanwhile, two women conversed inside a carriage, with one offering reassurance and suggesting they prioritize finding the right person to approach. As Van prepared for their guests, Till readied some tea and snacks, fretting over how many people might actually show up. Though he was filled with apprehension, he remained hopeful for a positive result. A knock sounded at his door, and he promptly welcomed his guests inside. Two women entered, one seasoned and the other young, and he greeted them by explaining that he had been appointed as the land's new overseer. The elder woman, Panamera Carrera, had recently been promoted to the rank of count after previously serving as a knight. The younger girl was Arut Ferdinand, the count's youngest daughter, who explained that her father had sent her to meet Pharaoh after learning he resided there. Van was surprised to find the youngest acting as Panamera's guard, and despite his lingering unease, he thanked them for visiting his humble village. He recognized that Panamera was both sharp and powerful, having achieved the rare feat of rising from a knight banneret to a count in a single generation. Panama noted his remarkable composure and lack of ulterior motives despite his youth, but as she questioned him about the purpose of their visit, Van realized she was testing his intuition. A count with shrunken lands might harbor bitterness, yet he was nonetheless impressed by the markets. Meanwhile, the Earl, fearing a strike from Marset, dispatched Panamera and a unit. Van proposed scouting the rival and attempting a negotiation, which made Panamera laugh, impressed that a 10-year-old could grasp the situation so thoroughly. She accepted his theory, noting that Mr. Ferdinand also found Pharaoh impossible to read. Recently, his name had been surfacing frequently as a key figure everyone was searching for, especially with a major event approaching to celebrate Marcus's ongoing success. Since the event had not yet started, they arrived, though she struggled to understand why he was chosen for this fief given his lack of four-element magic. Despite rumors calling him a prodigy, managing a territory typically required advanced education, leaving Graf to wonder why he had been stationed so close to the borders of the Count's land and the Jeanette Kingdom. This wasn't a case of someone simply reaching too far out of ambition. In a place where noble infighting was strictly prohibited, Van found himself intrigued by the woman's bluntness. Though he admitted to lacking any elemental magic, he assured her that the rest of her concerns were completely unfounded. Panama found it difficult to believe he had been abandoned there on a whim, questioning the rumors of him being part of a crew since she had heard the village was only a small settlement of 100 houses. Within just a few months, he had managed to erect massive fortress walls and upgrade his structures using materials no one had ever seen before. Furthermore, he was supported by a proficient butler and an elite master knight. She estimated that he had a following of at least 5,000 people. She noted that while stealth technology was a major concern, he intentionally made his presence known, effectively transforming the border into a massive military hub. This reaction only served to fuel her determination further. Apologizing for his laughter, he set out to correct her misconceptions and clarify the situation. He explained that the only items his father permitted him to bring were some quinine and basic gear. His family didn't even bother to wave goodbye, simply instructing him to leave without making a sound. She questioned him insistently about the events of that night, the butler, and the people gathered outside. Before Van could respond, Deep interrupted, explaining that they had followed him because they were drawn to his sharp intellect and natural talents. He mentioned receiving a late-night order to return, yet he chose to ignore it completely. Espa chimed in, acknowledging that he was also getting on in years. Upon seeing Van Leving, he decided it was the ideal moment to retire and pass his knowledge down to him. Till noted that regardless of his noble status, Van treated everyone with fairness, expressing her gratitude for serving a compassionate master who truly valued his team. Van felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the loyal companions who had followed him to such a remote location. Panamera pressed for a clear explanation of how the village had evolved. He chose to show her instead of explaining, though his demonstration left her feeling completely bewildered. While they were outdoors, he nonchalantly mentioned his desire to build an additional fortress. Upon stepping outside, Van found the villagers waiting for him, so he requested some wooden blocks and began leading them past the fortress walls. Panamera inquired about their destination, and he met her gaze with a steady look. He sensed her apprehension regarding a potential trap, but remained silent as their guide led them to a supposedly suitable location. After assessing the terrain, Van suggested constructing a wall 2 meters wide. He proceeded to build the fortress right in front of her, leaving the finer details to be adjusted later. After demonstrating his prowess as a formation mage, he sighed, realizing the wall would inevitably collapse once its magic was spent. The item was forged from a combination of bone, volcanic rock, earthen stones, and raw ore. Despite gathering a significant amount of resources, he lacked the specific supplies needed to make solid concrete and had to settle for a temporary fix. In complete awe, Panamera asked if those materials were also used to build houses. As he worked on the metal gate, he nodded, explaining that he needed to visualize its final form and overall durability. He finished constructing the wall and gate, leaving the onlookers completely speechless. This display led the princess and Panamera to begin questioning the true nature of his magic. He identified this particular power as production magic. His only talent was crafting, a skill that the rest of society deemed entirely worthless. Neglected by her preoccupied father and an indifferent mother, Princess Arut was ultimately left to be raised by a caretaker. He dismissed her, deeming her to be entirely useless. Known for her shy personality and academic struggles, she lacked any notable talent beyond her proficiency in puppetry magic. Despite her physical clumsiness in activities like dancing, her exceptional skill with dolls finally allowed her to bring a smile to her mother's face. Motivated by the rare hope of earning her mother's approval, she practiced tirelessly, only to be met with harsh insults that left her confused and questioning what she had done wrong. She later discovered that high society looked down on her magic, effectively crushing her last remaining hope. As her mother's visits ceased and those around her turned a blind eye, she lived in a state of silent, tense isolation. She took the blame upon herself, with the sound of her mother's shouting still echoing in her mind. When she reached the age of 10, her father summoned her for a meeting in Panamera's presence. She questioned his decision to send a novice and suggested someone else, but he dismissed her concerns to focus on Arut, who was left wondering about her. Panama asked if she was aware of a future marriage, a question that immediately brought tears to her eyes. Panama remarked that while her skills might lead to marriage proposals, none of the arrangements would be cancelled, though she still worried if her lack of talent meant she would be forced to leave home. Panama explained that since all her siblings were already married, finding a suitable match for herself would be sufficient. She held her hand warmly, finally making her feel truly cared for. During their 3-week journey, Arut experienced true happiness for the first time. Despite Panama's short temper and tendency to scold Arut for her perceived uselessness, she remained kind, often offering hugs and starting their conversations with a gentle head pat. While she wept, Panama remained calm and gently patted her once more. He dismissed her touch as nothing more than a playful jest. She had no interest in marriage, preferring instead to simply stay by Panama's side. She intended to meet the boy with a blank stare, as Van's unique nature deeply irritated her. He formed an immediate bond with Panamera and commanded the respect of his allies. Despite his youth, his accomplishments were vast, leading her to assume his parents held his talents in high regard. Their indifference caught her off guard, but after witnessing the impressive feats of his supposedly useless magic, her jealousy quickly shifted into fascination. Although she had given up her 4-element magic after her mother dismissed it, she was now reconsidering practicing the very power that the aristocracy held in such high regard. Panema identified a strategic location to fortify while eyeing the Graf's land, as Van noted that his father, who had exiled him for his production magic, remained completely unaware of its true value. Panama dismissed the situation as foolish, noting that while his abilities could have expanded their territory, even Van hadn't anticipated this outcome. He proposed continuing the wall's construction to allow her to stay longer, and since she had no other plans, she readily agreed. While strolling through the village, Panamera questioned him about his construction methods, asking if he was the only one who possessed production magic and what materials he used to build the houses. Although she only partially understood the situation, she felt that the confusion between them had finally been settled. Panama suggested the idea of marriage, leading him to wonder if that was her true motive for visiting. He acknowledged that while the surrounding magic beasts meant they had to keep fortifying the village, he didn't believe a marriage was necessary to maintain their peace. Intrigued, the report indicated that he was busy tending to his land. When Sir Ferdinand brought up the subject of her marriage, she firmly rejected the idea. Fearing a confrontation with the mayor's youngest child, a potentially hostile member of a frontier lord's family, she began to doubt her own heritage and sense of joy. Van Agreed also issued a stern warning about the lethal dangers posed by bandits and monsters. This is the reason Pan is desperate to find a way out of her forced marriage. Sensing her distress over the fear of being abandoned again, Van unexpectedly found himself empathizing with her situation. Her heart softened as she considered Van's happiness, deciding she would accept a proposal if he chose to marry her. Despite his youth, his wisdom and devotion to his people far exceeded his years, leading Panema to realize that Van's primary abilities were more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. She admitted that she would have married him if they were peers, a high compliment coming from such a beautiful woman. Van felt a surge of internal pride from her admiration. He maintained a neutral expression, carefully masking the genuine excitement he felt inside. She inquired if her feelings were mutual, gently reassuring her that she wouldn't be pressured into making a decision. Arut felt uncertain after Van admitted he hadn't considered marriage either, though he suggested she could simply stay in the village without marrying him if she couldn't return home, a proposal that required careful consideration. He argued that an arranged marriage would be beneficial, as the rapid growth of his village was already beginning to attract significant interest. Aware that his unique power could draw the attention of rival nations, he felt the urgent need to bolster his territory's defenses. Van inquired about the advantages of marrying Arut, and she clarified that the union would provide support from both herself and Graf Ferdinand, potentially deterring Ferdinand's forces from trying to seize back the land. He mused that a political marriage is most effective when it minimizes enemies and secures both allies and economic advantages. Graf stood to gain nothing by offering Arut, unless his father had secretly sent him there with a hidden motive. He remained in this spot, knowing that doing otherwise was not an option. Maintaining those ties offered no profit or logical justification. Mara decided they would stay the night, granting him a day to reflect on his choices and consult with either her or Arut. Reacting with the amusing curiosity of a typical 10-year-old, Van expressed surprise that they were staying and asked if any soldiers would be joining them. She claimed that enemy territory was far too hazardous for a fragile woman like herself to navigate without protection, though Van looked at her with skepticism, knowing full well the extent of her immense strength. She suggested heading over to Van's house, but the other girl was too shy to offer a response. Panamera apologized to Van for her youthful behavior and inquired about sharing a room. Noting the lack of space, Van immediately decided to construct a hostel. He led the group outside to construct more for Panamera, Arut, and the rest of the party. The soldiers prepared a 4-person room, a welcome surprise for those expecting tents, and invited them to stay for a dinner featuring tender, flaky wolf meat. Ortho's squad focused on hunting mystic beasts, noting that the armored dragon's presence had drawn even more creatures to the area. When a pack of scaly wolves recently appeared, Van's crew quickly dispatched them, securing a plentiful supply of high-quality meat. Till promised to prepare a proper meal for Van's union with Arut, leading Van to ask if she was truly comfortable with the arrangement. She confessed to feeling some lingering pain from their time together, but she trusted Arut to strengthen him and remained committed to serving him faithfully. Had his wife been a kinder person, she would have chosen to stay in the room. Canson suggested that he should have chosen a more formidable ally like Panamera, if given the chance. Assad agreed that Panamera spoke the truth, noting that the Count gained nothing from Van's status as a runt, and likely sent her away for lacking the 4 elemental magics while their kingdoms remained in conflict. Over the course of 5 years, Scaria had steadily broadened its influence. Aware that neighboring countries already feared their power, the king made sure to avoid any unnecessary friction with his allies. Recognizing that expansion through war would bankrupt them, Van considered alternative tactics like revoking their rights or inciting internal disruption. They argued that, regardless of marriage, the most important factor was Rut's own decision. He assured her that if returning home was impossible, she could stay in the village free from the pressure of marriage, though he would still allow her to leave whenever she chose. Since they hadn't shared a word yet, He planned to strike up a conversation with her during dinner. As they ate, Van opened the conversation by asking if she was enjoying the meal. He suggested they could prepare some sweets as soon as they gathered more ingredients. Arut was visibly taken aback to be speaking with her, but he felt a sense of satisfaction when she complimented the meat and fruit salad. As Arut slowly acclimated, she often stumbled over her words, but Van remained patient and never judged her for it. Even the impeccable Panamera couldn't help but recognize his exceptional potential. Still stunned by their encounter, she was taken aback when he began asking about her personal interests. She held an unwavering passion for anything cute, so when he asked if she liked small animals, she confirmed her fondness for them without hesitation. Surrounded by dolls, beautiful flowers, and motionless figures, Van, who was entirely unfamiliar with dolls, began to ask questions. He took a few moments to steady his aim before firing. Despite being younger than her, his calm and direct demeanor gave him an air of maturity. With a slow yet restless tone, she explained that her dolls were tucked away in the carriage and offered to show them to him the next day. Clearly delighted, Van offered her a beaming smile and expressed his gratitude. She felt an unusual thrill, her heart fluttering with a sudden sense of happiness. Too timid to meet his gaze, she let Van lead the conversation until she eventually felt comfortable enough to speak up herself. Throughout the entire meal, she struggled with the urge to speak to him, but her courage ultimately failed her before dinner concluded. He was reminded to emphasize the village's security and its serene atmosphere. Impressed by the meal, she wondered where he sourced such high-quality ingredients, noting that he was clearly held in high regard by the local community. Van acknowledged that Till's cooking was excellent, as the villagers celebrated the abundance of food, prompting Panama to suggest he should be more vocal about his achievements to ensure word of his success spread. Utilizing materials supplied by the locals, he constructed the village's walls and homes, looking forward to the day the population would finally surpass 1,000 residents. After their conversation with Van concluded, he noticed that Arut looked as though she had something more to say. 5 minutes later, she bowed and thanked him for the day, admitting she had been nervous because she thought he was her intended marriage partner. Reassured by his gentle nature, she bid him good night, feeling a mix of confusion and gratitude for the positive impression he had left behind. By midday, she spoke hurriedly and made a quick exit before he could manage a reply. Worried that others would find her strange or impolite, Arut struggled to navigate the building until a woman finally guided her to her room. As she stepped inside, she was greeted warmly by Panamera, who was already dressed in her pajamas. Anamura questioned if the children were overstepping their boundaries simply because they got along so well and encouraged her to speak her mind. Her face flushed a bright crimson, prompting Panamera to stop teasing and offer her the chance to stay for a few more days if she wished. After she decided to prolong her visit, Panamera pointed out that they couldn't host her group indefinitely, and suggested she pay in gold coins for their accommodations. Arut remained fixated on her plan to speak with him the following day, certain that he would listen to her. After a long time, she finally drifted off to sleep, feeling a genuine sense of excitement for the morning ahead. The next morning, Van informed the villagers that Asada would be supervising the construction of the fortress walls. Familiar with the job, he hoped for a seamless execution, but the project's massive scale prompted him to urge his crew to prioritize safety and efficiency, while expressing gratitude for the supplies they received. After noticing Ordo watching him, he questioned the man about his true motives. Ordo maintained that he was merely curious and wouldn't interfere. He recalled the sight of the villagers standing in military formation, prepared to hunt mystical creatures once more. Armed with their new swords, the task had become effortless. Van pointed out that while they could still profit from lower-grade materials, the high-quality ones should be reserved for Bell. With Friday finally here, he decided to use their meat stock for a barbecue spanning both today and tomorrow. The unexpected excitement rippled through the quiet village, transforming the atmosphere into a festive celebration. Panamera, who was also in attendance, found his speech quite compelling as it lifted the soldiers' spirits and concluded with him granting them their freedom as a gift. He encountered a rat that greeted him and began to speak. Noticing her vibrant energy in the pleasant weather, Van asked if she was feeling any lingering exhaustion from their trip the previous day. Despite the nerves building inside him, Arut made a conscious effort to keep his voice steady. She wanted to gain a better understanding of Van's perspective by examining his work up close. As the group set to work addressing the sewage issues, Panamera and Arut took the opportunity to wash up. Extending deep beneath every structure, these pipes required regular flushing with moat water to prevent filth from accumulating and spreading disease. The waste was funneled into underground chambers before eventually flowing back into the river. Suddenly, a group of people gathered and offered their assistance. Aura and those present were left startled, clearly puzzled by the unfolding situation. They all mentioned living in the area, so Van provided them with a meal just as Priola arrived and introduced herself as his wife. Panamera and Arut waited expectantly for his answer, but he merely closed his eyes in response. It was soon explained that the entire situation had been a simple misunderstanding. She clarified the situation to her father, explaining that they weren't actually engaged. Visibly agitated, he insulted them and stormed off while the others nearby looked on. Van faced a stern scolding, but he quickly diverted their attention with news of some delicious fruit, causing them to drop the matter entirely. He explained that they needed help retrieving slabs from the water, a task the Abolo completed in an instant. They committed to daily management, using Panam as a base to direct their operations. He explained that despite several contributing factors, they had finally settled there to focus on the ongoing castle wall project. Panamera surveyed her surroundings, finding the area to be truly impressive. After praising Asada for his speed, he noted that while the surface was smooth, the upcoming angles would be difficult, sketching a hexagonal outline on the ground to illustrate his point. After instructing Asada on the wall's unconventional design, Asada readily accepted the task. However, since the project's success relied entirely on the precision of the guide marks, he worried his rusty trigonometry skills wouldn't be enough, leading him to use the village center as his primary reference point instead. Panamera questioned him regarding the specific technique he used to draw the line. She proposed using a rope to measure and connect the lines for an accurate layout, and they began by gauging the length of the first side. After Van confirmed that Arut felt secure even without her guards, the two began overseeing the service, while simultaneously working to fortify the castle walls. Arut asked for clarification, prompting the man to explain exactly what a ballista was. A massive bow and arrow was constructed to bolster the village's defenses, and the top of the wall was widened to accommodate it. After enlarging the ballista, he crafted arrows as thick as a man's arm and implemented a two-tier system to allow for 2 consecutive shots, while also considering the design of a crossbow. Anxious about making a mistake, he braced himself for his first attempt, determined not to fail in front of the 2 charming girls. They proceeded to test the equipment with Kaman, and it performed flawlessly just as he had hoped, leaving the archer impressed by the bow's power. Van noted that its strength far surpassed that of a conventional bow and arrow. Just as Panama arrived on the scene, they inquired about the sudden noise, fearing a massive magical beast was launching an attack, but Van soon cleared up the misunderstanding. Caught off guard, she questioned whether similar ballistas were stationed atop the wall, though Van clarified that their designs varied slightly. Over 100 units already lined the defensive walls, with more planned for the future, prompting her to inquire about the timeline, cost, and materials as Vince noted her growing curiosity. However, he withheld the specific details, opting to call it a military seat instead. Stunned by the revelation, Panama emerged from the situation without feeling discouraged. He pressed for more and offered to buy a ballista at any price, but Van refused the sale while Panama struggled to grow. It was surprising to see just how much this remote village had managed to progress. Having made significant progress, Viscount Panamerica established new standards for production and magic while fostering loyalty among the various races. As Carrera Cayenne felt the long-forgotten sensation of a fresh breeze, she finalized an official pact with Van Pharaoh and prepared to notify the capital. The proposal arrived today via letter, and while domestic alliances typically focus on protection, she insisted on an equal partnership to firmly establish herself as Van's peer. As a fellow noble, betraying him would mean forfeiting her entire status, which presented Van with a golden opportunity. She enthusiastically agreed to the partnership, and Van responded with a respectful bow. His fellow soldiers and companions quickly followed his lead. Panama then stepped forward to offer a suggestion. She proposed a deal where she would provide 100 soldiers for 2 weeks in exchange for a ballista, though he would be held accountable for every single loss. Van accepted the terms and asked to see the troops. Needing a way to transport her heavy supplies and a fresh stock of arrows, she decided a carriage was necessary and planned to forge new tips from iron. As she worked out the logistics, Kaman approached her with a suggestion. While she examined a few of Van's arrows, Kaman presented the sword that Van had forged for him. He felt a unique bond forming as he approached Panamera, finding this new side of Kaman intriguing as she began to admit her own feelings. Feeling uneasy against enemies clad in armor and shields, she viewed her current gear as mere disposable backups and wished she had the skill to craft them herself. Kaman launched his opening attack, undeterred by the fact that his equipment was either damaged or of poor quality. However, he never anticipated that she would actually be caught in the blast. She managed to block the strike, but the true impact didn't sink in until she saw her sword split in 2, leaving everyone watching in complete disbelief. The onlookers watched intently as Panamera asked Kaman to confirm his statement. Van clarified that the sword wasn't iron, but a uniquely crafted piece of steel, noting that even the bolts were made of the same material. These steel arrows were exceptionally sharp, possessing enough force to pierce through multiple carapace dragons, much to the surprise of Panamera and her troops. Once again, his remarkable skill left her completely stunned, and shortly after, she collapsed. He felt a strong urge to purchase those arrows at night, unlike everyone else. The villagers spoke with Arut, encouraging her to look after Van should they marry, as they would love to have someone like her in their community. Though Arut was visibly flustered by the topic, Van eventually stepped in to ease her discomfort. He asked them to leave the guests alone, and though their teasing about him and Arut was embarrassing, he remained composed, advised them to stop drinking, and invited Arut to join the group. With the surveying complete, the construction was finally set to wrap up. With about a month remaining, he was asked to clarify if he was referring to the street. Inspecting a section of the wall, Van nodded in confirmation, leaving her amazed by the project's rapid progress, since even magically assisted construction usually took much longer to complete. After raising an earthen wall and letting the dirt settle for a time, he set out to complete the construction. They were required to finish a specific number of walls before the merchant Lantis arrived, or inquire about the merchant's status. Though he felt uneasy, Vanya simply smiled, expressing a desire to leave him completely stunned. Panamera's team proved to be both highly capable and dedicated to their work. Once the primary supplies arrived, Asada took the time to personally lay the foundation for the fortress. After mounting a ballista on top, Van completed the fortress just in time for dinner, though the others soon pulled him away from his work. 2 weeks later, the triangular fortress wall was finished, with standard ballistae positioned along the battlements. By installing everything at double the usual scale, the village building process became much more enjoyable, drawing praise from Panamera. Despite her impressive work, Van's gaze briefly wandered toward her figure, but he quickly regained his focus and thanked her for the assistance. After assisting with the fortress core, he suggested building homes for residents, merchants, and passing adventurers, a project Panamera had always envisioned. Although the project required a massive investment of time and capital, she felt she couldn't accept money from a prince who had just lost his lands in battle. He sought the freedom to exercise his military power without restraint, but as they spoke, the ground beneath them began to tremble. He trembled as Ordo shouted out a command. As the dragon drew closer, everyone present was left completely bewildered by the situation. In this remote location, a dragon appeared and began relentlessly pursuing Ordo. The crew decided to stall the threat so the others could retreat to the village, leaving Van stunned that Ordo was acting as the bait. While they had the option to fight inside, the risks were far too great. Van was uncertain how to conquer such a massive dragon this time, but he refused to let the village fall. As the villagers and bystanders fell victim to the creature, his team remained poised, waiting for his command. Panamera ultimately decided to step in and offer her support. After letting out a roar, the dragon began issuing commands. Taking matters into his own hands, he ordered Ordov to lure the dragon away, while the others readied the ballista, signaling for everyone to prepare for the counterattack. After Ordo and his group safely retreated behind the walls, they secured the gate and climbed up to assist, while Panamera began issuing her orders. She assigned 10 soldiers to escort Princess Arut to the village, and ordered the remaining troops to man the walls, noting that Arut seemed even more terrified than she was. She stood more paralyzed than ever before, and Van immediately sensed her overwhelming fear. He approached her to offer some reassurance, explaining the situation regarding the parched forest. The dragon proved to be a formidable adversary, its sheer power reinforced by its massive physical presence. Bolstered by the support of the 4-element mage Asada and Panamera, he felt his strength reach new heights. They admitted that victory still eluded them, but their firm vow to never give up finally helped Arut find her composure. After praying for a successful outcome, he assigned a guard to monitor her indoors and ensure no one else could catch a glimpse. As the gate drew near, Van instructed the crew to prepare for its arrival. They carefully operated the ballistae to ensure Ordo wouldn't be struck, as their primary objective was to. They focused their attacks on the wings to ground the dragon, overwhelming the creature with a relentless barrage. Stumbling as she pushed herself to the limit, she urged the others to leave her behind. But they ignored her plea and drew their weapons to stand their ground. Zara struck the dragon to divert its focus, buying herself enough time to stand and escape. He struck again, but the creature barely noticed. Sobbing, he fled while shouting for the others to leave him behind, only to be stunned when they actually complied. Choosing a different route, the swift Ordo assured a hesitant Zara that he would survive, urging her to reach the fortress first and promising to rejoin them later. After honoring Kusala's sacrifice, he ordered the ballista to fire once ready, while Panamera insisted she was capable of wounding her. He was determined to single-handedly bring it down with a single, decisive strike. She delivered a strike that perfectly reflected her new knight-level status. Just as Van had predicted, she demonstrated the true extent of her power as a supreme 4-element mage by unleashing a flame javelin. However, the dragons successfully managed to evade the fierce assault. They continued their pursuit, bringing the ballista along with them. However, its sharp eyes continued to evade my gaze. Despite the heavy barrage, only 5 bolts managed to find their mark, an impact that should have severely hindered the creature's wings and limbs. Van noted the crew's exhaustion as the massive ballistae reloaded slowly, yet he still pushed for a second volley to be fired as quickly as possible, only for the subsequent shot to miss the target entirely. Although the first strike had landed a lethal blow, Ordope was already making his next move. Paul and Zara reached the gate, realizing they weren't yet prepared to face the dragon head-on, just as Panama launched another attack. They launched a fire javelin to stall the creature while retreating toward the village, as they were forced to flee. He caught his first glimpse of elite fire magic, a force capable of devastating anything in its path. Now transformed into a dragon, she quickly made her way toward the village. They formulated a counter-strike and urged everyone to mobilize. He rushed over as well, finding the dragon already settled on its perch. The massive fortress remained grounded, its wings far too injured to take flight. No longer able to fly, he was forced to travel on foot, yet he remained confident he could handle the situation. Despite his experience defeating armored lizards, this creature was far more powerful than the typical local variants. As the monsters emerged, the group arrived on the scene and earned their rewards. He suggested retreating to the village while he stalled for time, but the offer was declined since he couldn't face the enemy alone. Rather than pushing the matter further, he began reviewing his combat equipment when, out of nowhere, Assad appeared. A figure appeared and approached the dragon, completely ignoring Van. Amid the shouting, Van finally stepped forward to make his declaration. They refused to leave unless Assad joined them, causing him to hesitate as he considered his next move. Without looking back, he noted that the situation might become complicated and asked Van to handle the rest. They managed to distract the dragon one last time before retreating, but when he told Van to lead the way, the boy refused to move even as the beast charged toward them. Assad launched a strike to buy them a few seconds, then desperately urged him to flee. However, his advanced age made him far too sluggish, leaving him vulnerable as Van readied his weapon for the strike. She used red wine to persuade him to escape, turning the gesture into a test of his resolve and true feelings. Kin intervened, directing Van to lead the soldiers in shielding the village while he focused on looking after Assad during their return. Maintaining such a high pace felt nearly impossible, and with his crew completely exhausted, Ordo was left uncertain of his next move until Panamera reached out to him. She informed him that her preparations were complete, prompting Van to begin issuing orders to the soldiers. As they prepared for another assault, Panamera asked about her specific role, catching Van off guard by her willingness to follow his lead. Remaining focused, he instructed her to use her magic to pin the dragon if it neared the fort, then strike it with the ballista, a plan Panama readily accepted. Despite possessing magical abilities, she had never actually put them to use. Freezing an enemy in that manner was impressive, but it mattered little against a true dragon as it began to emerge. They made sure to depart from the ruins ahead of time. This news quickly spread, alerting everyone across the globe. To save Ferdasada and the others, he only needed a few more moments for Panamera to finish preparing her spell, and Dee stepped in to buy him that time. His own soldiers provided me with that assurance. Despite their hesitation, the group reassured Van that the gear he had crafted for them would hold strong, and Dee's party finally began their mission. They launched their assault on the dragon, beginning with these initial strikes. They even managed to sever one of the creature's toes as he watched the others finally drift off to sleep. While the beasts were under fire, Asada joined the assault with a strike of his own, leading to a direct confrontation between him and Campson. As they headed toward the village and ordered a full retreat, Van was astonished by his ability to reach the settlement. They continued on despite their injuries, with Dee, the eldest, bearing the worst of the pain. He managed to outrun them all just as the soldiers were closing in. Prepared for any command, Signal Panamera finally unleashed her flames. Bialist fired off a series of rounds. Approaching from the western outskirts, Daros soared through the air toward the village. While many of the attacks missed the dragon, one final strike remained. After landing a powerful strike, Van commanded his allies to deploy their next move. After exhausting every last shot, the dragon finally began to weaken. Although it shielded its head, the arrows pierced its body with fatal accuracy, just as the order was given to ready the ballistas. After firing several more rounds, he waited a moment before asking Dee to inspect the area. The dragon began to approach, moving with careful deliberation. He then lightly tapped its head with the blade of his sword. Despite the dragon's menacing snarl, he managed to evade the strike and deliver a finishing blow with his sword. He finished the job with a single cut, finally letting out a sigh of relief. He stepped forward to officially announce their victory. They took a final shot to celebrate, and cheers erupted as they finally proved their worth. Till and Arut Reshta were honored as the victors of the recent triumph. Approaching him with concern, they asked if Van was all right, and he reassured them that he was doing just fine. SBD and the two warriors who had repelled the dragon onslaught quickly made their way indoors. As Van sat down to recover, Panamera arrived to praise his decisive leadership and congratulate him on his first dragon kill, a feat he still struggled to wrap his head around. Asada and Panamera admired his blunt honesty when he admitted he would have proceeded without her, especially considering the dangers of the forest. Following the dragon's assault on the prince's territory, nearly half the city lay in ruins with its walls crumbling and hundreds dead, leaving Van completely paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. He noted that if the royal mansion were located within the city, it would possess elite defenses. Panama remarked that and Asada were destined to go down in history as heroes, filling the group with pride, though Panama was quick to point out a different reality. Realizing his shots were too weak to do more than chip the dragon's scales, he knew he needed a more effective strategy. Seeking to enhance their power, Panama suggested initiating the dragon's conquest tribute first, declaring that had finally earned his reward. After obtaining the Dragon Slayer title, the village leader Van secured the Warlord title and invited Asada to join them, as she beamed with joy at the news. In the upcoming sequence, he would officially be granted the title of Dragon Slayer. Van addressed the crowd following their victory over the forest dragon, announcing that everyone who fought would be duly rewarded. Feeling deeply honored, he noted that the awards would be presented by Pan. The villagers waited with eager anticipation for Mara Carla Cayenne, the current head of the Cayenne noble family. He waited for her to finish speaking as she began explaining the state of the forest. The dragon was finally brought down by the combined efforts of knights and wizards who fought tirelessly to save the village. By stopping a beast capable of leveling entire settlements and forts, these heroes proved their immense value to the people. Since not a single villager perished, the mission was hailed as a resounding success, earning them high praise as she began her report. Drawing on his extensive knowledge of weapons and war, the deputy chief knight of the fellow noble family, arrived to claim the dragon's head and seal the battle's fate. Sada, a respected wizard of the four elements, utilized his powerful magic to restrain the dragon, establishing himself as a pivotal figure in the battle. The crowd erupted as Philo, the fourth son of a fellow noble family, was announced. Despite being only 8 years old, his clever tactics and wisdom brought a unique strategic edge to the battlefield as the villagers cheered him on. He rapidly reinforced the village's defenses, his careful planning establishing him as the true cornerstone of the fight. As their leader, he ultimately guided them to victory, taking in the sight of the gathered crowd. Hearing his name called, Van blushed and offered a shy wave as the ceremony commenced. The atmosphere was building as the festival finally got underway. Shortly after, Panamera tested the handcrafted sword and was so stunned by its sharpness that she could hardly believe the results. Van revealed that he had crafted everything himself, casually shrugging it off as a basic weapon made from common materials. She was stunned to learn he'd forged hundreds of these alone. But with a grin, Van offered to make her a custom blade for 5 gold coins as a system panel appeared. With the Mara family's massive army gathering materials at such a rapid pace, the warehouse soon reached its capacity, prompting him to start building an underground facility. This project was only halfway complete when street merchants arrived with an armored lizard caravan, accompanied by Lingo. He was stunned by the village's transformation and began inquiring about the recent changes. Bell pointed out that they had a more pressing concern to address, while Van offered a warm welcome as Lango began to share his information. He managed to recruit the head of the trading firm, who brought along 5 large and 3 medium caravans, while he and Forest Quartz led a security force of 20 people and 5 slaves. He led them to the new warehouse, where they finally caught sight of the dragon. Seeing 10 bodies scattered across the ground, the merchants' initial panic began to subside as they tried to rationalize the scene, only for them to realize a massive forest dragon was truly present as Bell explained the situation. The dragon's high-quality remains, including its scales, fangs, and magic stones, were worth a fortune. He estimated they would fetch at least 100 platinum coins at a capital auction, perhaps even reaching 150. He never imagined the dragon could be worth tens of billions of yen, prompting him to ask for more information. The narrative then shifted to the events following the auction and the fate of Belle Claire. It was confirmed that the event would take place in the capital, a hub for luxury goods that drew the Merchants Guild into the trade of these specific units. He estimated that the high-quality goods would fetch at least 150 platinum coins, but after factoring in the overhead for transport and sales, he wondered if Bell and Lango would still walk away with a significant profit, leaving Bell feeling guilty. Recognizing that the situation might be overwhelming for an 8-year-old, Van avoided the typical noble's mistake of blaming others for a lack of leverage, and instead carefully considered their perspective. He proposed taking a cut of 3 to 5 platinum coins, ensuring the deal remained profitable for everyone involved as they prepared to begin. Navigating the demanding trading firm proved difficult, and Bell soon found himself caught off guard. Caught off guard by the question, he stood there silently while the other merchants looked on. He stepped in, offering various promises and making a single claim. As the kingdom's leading merchant group, they considered opening a branch in the village, though Van voiced his doubts about whether the small settlement could sustain such a business. The man explained that their role involves both buying and selling, promising high-quality goods at competitive rates, prompting Van to seek the driver's input. They quoted a price of 80 platinum coins, and when he pressed for the final sale value, they explained that the total would decrease once their commission fees were deducted. They intended to sell the armored lizard before sending representatives to the village, as the conversation continued to revolve around the battle's results. Once the excitement faded, interest in the village would likely drop, provided the monster activity remained under control. They established a large shop here for their trade, and while merchants would cut into his margins, he was still set to receive a high price for the dragon and lizards. It was clear that profit was the only priority in this place, so he offered his thanks before addressing them. Van promised to consider the offer, ignoring their claims that he was too young for such business dealings. He dismissed their concerns, suspecting they had undervalued the dragon's price compared to the estimate Lango had provided. The price was finalized at 100 platinum coins instead of 8, and the merchants promptly recorded the transaction. He pushed back, arguing that all traders prioritize profit while warning of potential bandits on the road, though the others eventually intervened to demand fairness in their squad's sales. They planned for the expenses to be covered by their profits, confident that even at the starting auction price, they would earn a substantial amount. After Bell suggested that smart merchants choose routes free of bandits, the veteran traders grew incensed, calling him insane and griping at the boy. Since traders rarely visited the village, 80 platon was considered a fair price. This deal ensured that every member of the group would pocket at least 1 coin. One of them offered a high sum in an attempt to buy his silence. Despite their efforts, Van was still able to overhear the conversation. He hadn't expected a rejection, yet Bell ultimately decided to turn him down. He abandoned his deceptive tactics and committed to acting fairly, convinced that honesty would eventually yield a much larger reward. They hopped inside while hurling insults at Bell, warning that the head merchant's fury would lead to their ruin before they finally stormed off. He hadn't heard a single negative rumor, as despite his noble status, his knowledge of the merry merchants was purely positive. He recognized that even if a customer was just a young child who might not return often, maintaining strong communication was still essential for preserving ties with their current clientele, leading Van to inquire if they were concerned about. After losing a platinum coin, they simply reassured him that it wasn't a problem. Despite knowing who they were, their specific merchant group affiliation remained a mystery, and Rango felt that execution was an undeserved fate. Known as the real merchants, they possessed no desire to pass judgment. Large merchant groups like this one often prefer to operate independently, relying on hired protection to secure their trade. Bell offered to transport the goods to the capital, where they would first need to register with the guild before the auction. He explained that entry required 3 specific things: a costly trade union membership, ownership of an established shop, and the backing of a noble. While the first 2 steps were simple, securing noble support proved far more complex. Under their regulations, nobles retain full legal authority, allowing them to reap the profits while the actual founders receive only minor rewards. He then inquired about the potential selling price of the beverage. They negotiated over the dragon and the specific profit percentage they expected from each sale. Satisfied with his decision to join them, he established a variable sales fee based on market rates, while Van inquired about which noble family backed the merchant group. The 2 brothers paused for a moment before making a discovery. It was eventually revealed that they had been collaborating with the nation's ruling power, the Berliner nobility. Once the firm was established, the nobility began recommending their own for hire, allowing the company to grow larger and more influential through these high-level connections. By providing excellent service to their patrons, they were able to maintain a solid reputation and secure the support of the nobility. Nevertheless, Van couldn't help but feel that the royal family's blatant favoritism was fundamentally unfair. The Mary Corporation strategically positioned its shops in the country's most prominent locations, serving as the primary hub for selling rare materials and the captives they had seized. Furthermore, they successfully secured the backing of every single lord. Rango noted that Mary Triumph, the original head of the Mary Corporation, was rumored to have been the mistress of an ancient king. Competing companies kept a watchful eye on them, as any hint of a scandal could cause their backers to withdraw their support immediately. This led Van to wonder if the Merchant Guild possessed deep-seated ties to powerful organizations spanning several different countries. Operating from a foreign base, they believed they would remain safe as long as they strictly followed the rules. Belle gave her approval, acknowledging that her support was the primary reason they could finally establish their shop. Belle was about to suggest her own home, but Van intervened, explaining that his family's connections were off-limits now that his father had disowned him, and his brother held no noble status. Realizing Panamera was the only noble ally he could turn to, he promised to reach out and speak with her. The merchant brothers were so swept up in their excitement that they completely missed his clarification about only intending to ask. His thoughts turned to Panamera, as he realized this situation could lead to serious trouble for her. Van reached out to Panamera for support, and she accepted his request without a second thought. She explained that, as a new noble, she had little to lose by backing two small businesses, which might even disrupt the royal family if they gained enough influence, a possibility Van hadn't considered, as he was unaware of the monarchy's internal struggles. He questioned if his upbringing as a count influenced his mindset, while Panamera noted that without land or a knightly order, she would need to make a daring move to secure the count's attention. The request played perfectly into her hands, as the feat of 100 soldiers slaying a dragon would provide a striking entrance to the palace, especially since those in the remote villages never expected them to be capable of such a victory. Van felt a wave of excitement, realizing that if Panama took all the credit, he could remain overlooked by his family, exactly the outcome he was hoping for. She explained that defeating a dragon with so few casualties would inevitably draw the scrutiny of high-ranking nobles. If the scale of the deal increased, details like their combat methods and the location would surface, potentially attracting the royal knights. Van's excitement faded as he realized that even if he credited Panamera for the victory, it wouldn't be enough to protect his secret. He knew that investigators would keep digging until they eventually discovered he was the one responsible. The prospect of being dragged back to his family home left him feeling utterly dejected. Surprised to see someone so young looking so overwhelmed right after leaving his home, Panama approached the man and offered to show him a way to escape his troubles. Van eyed her with curiosity, considering the suggestion she had just put forward. He decided to become a noble himself, seeking the independence needed to establish his own house. She spoke as if it were as simple as finding a new place to live, even proposing a scenario where he took all the credit for the dragon's defeat. He immediately grew anxious, fearing that such a story would make him stand out far too much. She simply questioned what the issue was, but Van's real struggle was her proximity. She stood so close that her chest was right in his face, forcing him to fight to maintain his composure. He hesitated to pursue the new power, wary of his father's unpredictable nature and the potential for his younger brothers to cause trouble. Attaining noble status before the king's eldest son would certainly attract unwanted attention. Panamera argued that an 8-year-old slaying a dragon would skyrocket his rank and earn him a massive fortune. With a flourishing company and several successful milestones, she still understood exactly why he felt so uneasy. Her rise to nobility had earned her several enemies, many of whom were already looking for ways to exploit her. However, she easily crushed every last one of them. She suggested he deal a crushing blow to his enemies, ensuring that once a few were defeated, no one else would dare challenge him. Her blunt perspective forced Vans to confront the true brutality of the world they lived in. He noted that if he claimed all the credit for himself, she would be left without any recognition or fame. Panamera coolly dismissed his concerns, stating she didn't need an 8-year-old worrying about her, prompting Van to quickly retreat once he felt her intimidating presence. His priorities shifted to his own safety as he tried to avoid upsetting her, but she only laughed, telling him to relax since she had no intention of eating him. She decided to let him take the credit while he spent the next 5 years growing stronger, leaving Van with a narrow window to truly make his mark. 2 days later, he received an offer of 130 platinum coins for the forest dragon. He accepted the offer without hesitation, and the deal was finalized seamlessly. Panama's condition was a share of his future business profits once he attained the rank of baron, and upon Rango's return to the capital, they sold the forest and armadillo dragons as materials. Rango cautioned that their sluggish pace would eventually catch up to them, leaving Belle to worry about how they would justify returning to the Merchant Guild empty-handed. Panama suspected the merchants were already reaching their breaking point. Unable to manage the burden alone, they would soon be forced to sell everything for 80 platinum coins, a resolution that was as ruthless as it was efficient. Rango suggested building a carriage and hiring Koro's party for security, but Panamera insisted on bringing her own army to the capital instead. She reminded Van that by focusing on his goal of becoming a noble, he would no longer have to worry about securing his own manpower or protection. Van expressed his gratitude, his expression radiating a sense of genuine joy. Seeing him genuinely happy for a change caused Panama to blush. She cautioned him to keep his thoughts to himself, and Van was nearly overwhelmed when he noticed her cheeks begin to redden. Bill voiced his concerns about the massive carriage and numerous horses needed to transport the dragons, but Van assured him that he already had everything under control. He constructed a massive, lightweight platform carriage using wooden blocks and draped a cloth over the materials. Panama provided a team of trained military horses to haul it along. The merchants pressed on, continuing their steady journey across the land. They whispered malicious rumors about Van and Belle as the two walked away. Suddenly, they noticed a group of peculiar, oversized carriages and knights approaching, leaving them anxious and wondering who could have sent them. Its immense size made it clear this was no ordinary noble's carriage, and as it rolled past, they caught sight of a massive eye. The commotion and struggling from within only served to baffle them further. One merchant realized that if Bell and Rango secured noble support, they would quickly climb the guild's ranks, rendering his own difficult border deliveries a waste of effort and a total financial loss. Since their deal relied entirely on securing 40 items from the Armadillo Dragon, returning empty-handed would ruin their standing as merchants, prompting them to brainstorm a way out of the crisis. One individual even suggested accusing Bell and Rango of exploiting their generosity and deceiving them. They headed back, hoping the guild would find their account of events convincing. Within the Scuteria kingdom, Cain Dino of Shurabellin ascended the throne at 16 and completely overhauled the military by the age of 20. Surpassing his ancestors with overwhelming power, he crushed internal betrayals and sidelined his own kin to secure his rule. By purging the old commanders and training low-ranking officials into elite soldiers, he successfully built a military force centered entirely on strength. Through a long and violent process of reform, every noble was forced to serve as either an officer or a vice commander, a mandatory shift that completely disrupted the established order. While weaker noble lines like Count Finetz lost their standing, militarily powerful houses such as Mark Finetz began to gain significant ground. In recognition of her exceptional prowess, King Dino personally elevated Panamera to the rank of nobility. Born into a lineage of knights in the capital, she was sent to a council-governed territory for rigorous training as soon as her magical potential emerged. She pushed herself relentlessly, often sacrificing sleep to focus entirely on her studies. Her dedication eventually earned her the role of team captain, and by the age of 16, she was already commanding the Count's knights. Panamera's list of accomplishments only grew from there, most notably during the war against the Kingdom of Veneta, where her leadership shifted the momentum of the conflict and secured her a place among the nobility. They exploited her service as a knight, using the promise of a noble title as a mere front. Impressed by her remarkable success, His Majesty granted her the title of Count in just 6 short years. He admitted that, given her recent accomplishments, he had fully expected her to request an even higher rank. To his surprise, she suggested the offer go to someone else, leading the king to inquire about the identity of her chosen candidate. Panamera identified the candidate as a feudal lord who couldn't travel to the capital or send a representative. When the king questioned her unconventional choice, she defended the nomination by highlighting the man's incredible potential and the future achievements he was destined for. The king was intrigued that such a renowned military figure would offer praise, yet he remained skeptical of a lord who governed barren lands without a single knight or soldier to his name. Doubts about his achievements lingered, but the entire room fell into a stunned silence once Panama revealed that the mission was actually a dragon subjugation. They speculated he might be a 4-elemental mage, but she clarified that he was actually exiled for his inability to use magic, despite his family's prestigious reputation. King's interest was piqued the moment she gave him a name. Next was the son of Maris, a young hero who had already slain a dragon at the age of 8. The king was blindsided by Marcus's silence on the matter, but Panamera confirmed the story after speaking with Van and the villagers herself. She explained that a small settlement of barely 100 people had been under constant attack by thieves until Van stepped in, eliminating the threat with only a few followers and hired adventurers. He fortified the village with mud walls and restored the damaged homes, leaving the court skeptical that a 6-year-old could have achieved such a feat. Panama continued to describe his modest team, which consisted of over 100 villagers, the vice-captain of the knights, an elderly mage, and 5 adventurers, noting that she had previously assisted in a dragon subjugation by holding the beast back. Ultimately, Van and Lord Boneo secured the victory without suffering a single casualty. Finding the claim hard to believe, they demanded proof, prompting Panama to gesture toward the dragon materials. They were stunned to see an additional 40 armored lizards, a force so large that even the elite royal knights would struggle to defeat them. Despite failing to win them over during the intense debate, she cross-referenced the details with the villagers and found that their testimonies perfectly matched the report. While the king didn't doubt Panama's honesty, he found it peculiar that she would credit a child who appeared so easily influenced, When asked if someone had officially granted Van his territory, she confirmed that was the case. He added that he would be attending the dragon's inspection in a few days, so there was no need to overcomplicate matters, but he warned her that she would lose her rank and face punishment if this proved to be a scheme. Accepting the inherent risks, Panama went so far as to invite the king to attend. He proposed granting Van new territories to safeguard, framing it as a vital move for the kingdom's defense. The king eagerly anticipated his meeting with Van in his dragon form. The dragon was brought forward, leaving the onlookers in a state of absolute awe. Panama officially declared Van a fellow baron, though his rewards for slaying the forest dragons would be finalized at a later date. The entire court was left stunned, particularly by the arrival of the new vanguard. She informed Belle and Rango that they were finally clear to work with the guild and launch their business, leaving Rango overjoyed even as Panama questioned if he was still using his brother's identity. He expressed his satisfaction, noting that he was simply happy to see his younger brother finally gaining some recognition. By the next morning, the capital was abuzz with news of the new business launch and the circulating rumors of Van Fellow's potential promotion to Baron. Van was hailed as a dragon-slaying hero, with rumors spreading of a young, powerful swordsman who had severed the beast's head. This sounded far too incredible, even for the most baseless rumors. Panamera didn't mind being sidelined. Instead, she found the growing curiosity surrounding Van to be quite fascinating. She had expected him to show some appreciation for the assistance she provided. In the 6 weeks since Panama's group departed, Van had produced a surplus of ballistae. Though the village's 100 residents had little use for so many weapons, Van's own home had been upgraded and relocated to the center of the village for better accessibility and appeal. They had also successfully constructed 2 towers. Ken favored Aringo Tower for its urban street views, while Till preferred the lakeside scenery of Voodoo Tower. After spotting Van and confirming he was heading to Aringo Tower, Dee decided to change plans and head toward Voodoo instead. The 10-minute climb to the top left the group completely exhausted, though Kaman managed the ascent without any trouble. However, Till and Van Rebeat was a different matter entirely. Upon reaching the summit, the breathtaking view made the entire climb worth the effort. Van questioned if such a massive tower was excessive for a village of only 100 people, but it was pointed out that their advanced infrastructure and equipment made it feel more like a burgeoning city. Even though he had previously rejected the name for Van's village, the idea continued to linger, leading him to suspect Till might jokingly suggest Vantown next. However, Till remained unfazed by the teasing, and insisted it was a solid choice. Van suspected she was merely teasing him, but she soon called him over to examine something. Van was unable to see them, but Kin's sharp eyes easily outperformed the villagers. He noted that the group didn't look like soldiers or adventurers, consisting instead of many children, the elderly, and even a slave trader. Still reeling from the shock, Van decided to have a meal during the hour-long journey, while Till served him his favorite egg rolls and a sandwich made with premium bread provided by Belle. The 8 Alti have finally made their appearance. Panamera made her way back to the capital, though Alti decided to stay behind for the time being. Van asked what was going on, his formal speech slipping as he felt like an adult addressing a child. Though he found her behavior adorable, his feelings were strictly platonic, leaving him with nothing but a simple urge to pat her head. Distracted by her charm, he barely registered Alti suggesting he use her nickname instead, as her formal title seemed to be a bit of a struggle for him. Van gave his consent and then asked about the purpose of her visit. She warned that a crowd was approaching and expressed her concern, as they possessed no resources or influence within the city walls. As they headed toward his office, Van noticed her speech becoming more casual as she grew comfortable with him, despite her occasional bouts of annoyance. Van suggested they move the conversation to the house to ensure the newcomers were friendly, noting that Oro's party had already headed into the forest earlier that morning. Van Toland set off to retrieve Dee and Asada, departing to bring them back. Motivated by Ken's dedication, Van decided to incorporate training sessions into the breaks between his construction projects. He was capable of withstanding this grueling training all by himself. Unbeknownst to him, his swordsmanship had already eclipsed Van's, and as Ab and Lou trained his rivals as well, Van began to wonder if he was lacking something more than just stamina. He eventually acquired all of the common skills. He soon realized that, just like back home, social status here was defined by athletic ability. Asada then informed Van that the group had arrived from another village and offered to bring their leader to his room for a meeting. Drenched in sweat, an exhausted man arrived and inquired if he had finally reached Seat Village. Expecting a modest settlement, they were stunned to find a grand city instead. Turning to Asada for information, he learned that a man named Seat once lived there, leaving such a profound impact that the village was eventually named in his honor. Van was left speechless, feeling deceived after being led to believe the village was nameless. Asada admitted he had remained silent, secretly hoping Van would name the village after himself, and while he puzzled over Van's peculiar nature, he confirmed the settlement was officially known as the Village of Seat. Struggling to process the drastic changes around him, Van questioned the man's intentions. The reality of it all was hard to fathom, and as his patience finally snapped, he shouted, demanding to know why the man was there. The man explained that their neighboring village was struggling with a shrinking youth population and stagnant high taxes, forcing them to ask if they could merge with the Village of the Sea. Recognizing the hardships of migration, Van questioned the decline of the local youth, wondering if they left for financial gain or simply preferred to stay behind. The man clarified that the youth hadn't left of their own free will, as they had been conscripted into military service. With too few workers remaining to meet their tax obligations, the Count showed total indifference toward their remote border village. When Van noted the significant distance between their settlements, the man explained it took an adult 2 weeks to make the journey. They had chosen this village over the city specifically to escape the Count's retribution, believing the Viscount's land would be safer. A more cautious noble might have turned them away, as Van's decision to accept them could easily be misinterpreted as him poaching subjects and inviting conflict. However, considering the life-threatening journey these people endured to reach him, Van refused to shut them out. While he hoped to avoid a feud with the Count's family, he simply couldn't ignore those in desperate need. Van inquired about their intentions to settle there, promising that he wouldn't be imposing any taxes for the time being. Now that they had food and shelter, they could begin working together for the village. While only 13 people arrived today, their total number had reached 300, and he warned them that each family would receive only one house to keep their expectations realistic. The man's attempt to win Van over by offering his own grandchild only sparked irritation, as Van was disgusted by how casually people here traded children like mere gifts. While he was aware that feudal lords often bartered with their daughters, the practice still deeply repulsed him. Van offered to provide carriages and asked if 2 horses would be sufficient, but the man declined the horses, noting they could use the cows they had back home instead. His curiosity was piqued by the mention of the cattle, and the man explained that the Count had entrusted him with the herd, which consistently grew by 5 to 10 calves every year. Van welcomed the idea and suggested moving the cattle under Ortho's protection, while also advising the weary village chief to take the rest of the day to recover. The man, however, clarified that he was not actually the chief. The crowd was astonished by the living quarters, with some even remarking that it surpassed the grandeur of a feudal lord's mansion. While the others speculated that the lord might have lent the items out, Van knew his own craftsmanship was far superior, so he stepped in to announce a welcome feast and a trip to the Grand Bath. After instructing Kaman to alert the villagers and assist the cook, Van suddenly realized that she was actually the Count's daughter. He explained that he hadn't intended to cause trouble, clarifying that the villagers from a nearby settlement were no longer able to stay in their homes. For the time being, he offered to provide them with both food and a place to stay. Alti Lift expressed her relief, remarking that they could build a good life there, while Van felt grateful she didn't pry into their origins as they walked together. He checked in on how she had enjoyed her 2 months there, asking if she intended to stay. Halti expressed that she would be happier living there, but Van reminded her they were still just children, urging her to set aside any talk of marriage and simply tell him what she truly wanted. Ultimately, that was all that truly counted, and despite her visible nerves, Alti happily agreed to marry him. He then playfully questioned if she truly intended to marry him, hoping to fluster her even further. However, he prided himself on being a gentleman who would never stoop to humiliating a woman. He urged her to abandon the plan, and the rest of the group quickly voiced their agreement. Noticing his unusual gait, Van dismissed it as a confident stride, remarking that boys often feel on top of the world when they become popular. At that moment, Aro's team staggered back into the village, visibly battered and wounded. Ortho revealed that they had successfully located a dungeon entrance within Van Froze. This was the exact encounter he had been desperately trying to steer clear of. The area was teeming with yellow birds, peculiar merchants, and small monsters. Asada leaned on Van, insisting they report their discovery to the capital immediately, while questioning if his father would come for them if they failed to do so. Van conceded that reporting to the royal capital was the most strategic move, though his original plan to earn nobility and bring prestige to his land had been sidelined by their current predicament. He began mapping out plans for an adventurer's guild and armor shops, even considering a casino and host club to accommodate the rougher crowds, while Ortho offered a sincere apology. Van insisted that the discovery made the situation inevitable, leading him to choose Hura to deliver the news to the capital. Heuristic felt uneasy about venturing out alone, but Van reminded him that his own curiosity had already led him to discover the dungeon. With no reason to complain, Ortho agreed that Kura was the ideal choice, though he still hoped to join the group. Van insisted he remain behind to guard the arriving villagers instead, offering a large gold coin as payment for the task. As soon as gold was mentioned, the group abandoned Kira with a quick wish of luck. But Van, noticing his dejected expression, handed him a mithril dagger. Upon seeing it, the others had a sudden change of heart, now eager to venture out on their own. While Ortho and the crew departed to escort the new villagers, Kira began her journey toward the royal capital. With his journey finally complete, Kura took a moment to admire the sunset while inspecting his newly acquired daggers. He was grateful Van had provided the weapon, as he found it remarkably easy to handle. After setting up camp for the night, he spent the following day so fixated on his blade that the journey passed in a blur, bringing him within just a few kilometers of the capital. He caught sight of a carriage being ambushed by a group of orcs. This applied to every variety of orc, regardless of their specific classification. They were driven by their most basic instincts, living only for food, sleep, personal desires, and acts of violence. He reasoned that this mechanism was designed to strike or injure anyone caught inside. Things would have been significantly more difficult without the dagger to rely on. By now, Kura considered the entire ordeal to be nothing more than child's play. He made quick work of the orcs, dispatching them with absolute ease. He even went so far as to warn the others to stay back for their own safety before ultimately finishing them off. Once again, he found himself admiring the craftsmanship of the advanced custom-made mithril dagger. A young girl named Amelia Stust then emerged from the carriage, expressing her gratitude for his help. Believing him to be a person of high status, she inquired about his name. Panicking slightly, Kira introduced himself as a simple adventurer, but his high-quality clothing and exceptional dagger made her skeptical. Suspecting he was concealing a prestigious identity, she remained unconvinced despite his attempts to explain himself. She explained that she had traveled to the royal capital on foot, and having nothing to offer him now, promised to repay his kindness later. Kura explained he was headed for the capital and offered her a ride. Despite her hesitation to be a burden, he quickly lifted her onto his horse, jokingly remarking that the animal would prefer her company over his own. Amelia was visibly touched, remarking that at 30 years old, it had been a long time since anyone had addressed her as a lady. Kira remained skeptical, and noting that she barely looked 20, he asked where she was traveling. She explained that her escort had deserted her during the journey, leading Kira to ask about her reasons for traveling to the capital. She explained that her father, a viscount, had perished in battle, leading to the seizure of their estate and the loss of their noble status, which forced her to seek work as a maid. Though she felt a bit shy about the admission, she took comfort in knowing that Kura wasn't the type to judge. Assuming she was also a freelancer, he invited her back to his border village with the promise of steady work and his personal protection. Amelia was pleased to meet Kura and didn't hesitate to accept his offer. Upon arriving at the Adventurers Guild, they reported their discovery of a dungeon located near the border. They were currently situated deep beneath the territory belonging to Marcus Pharaoh. The guild announced that the location was near the same village known for defeating a forest dragon and armored lizards, now governed by the newly appointed Baron Van Pharaoh. Furthermore, the guild finalized their plans to establish a new branch in that location. He proceeded to purchase the materials at a 20% markup. A reward was promised to anyone who could provide a functional and detailed map of the dungeon. Amidst the cheers of the crowd, the adventurer hounded Kura with questions regarding Van and the dungeon. After deciding to head out, Kura and Amelia spent their remaining time exploring the capital, though a group of persistent adventurers continued to trail them against their orders. After Kura delivered Amelia's meal to her room, she expressed guilt for constantly relying on him. But he dismissed her concerns and asked if she was still certain about joining him. In response, Amelia admitted it had been a long time since she'd smiled so sincerely, all thanks to him. Kura spoke fondly of Van, praising his sharp wit and immense potential, which left Amelia eager to meet the boy and see his village firsthand. Elsewhere, Ortho and his squad were busy escorting the surrounding villagers toward Van's village. Ortho concluded that Kura had headed straight for the capital. Following the incident with the forest dragon, Periel cautioned the group to remain on high alert, recalling how they had been far too talkative during their last encounter. Periel quickly silenced Ortho's attempt to protest. Both were taken aback by the sheer number of villagers, and were even more stunned to find that every single one of them wanted to leave. Ortho had witnessed many succumb to starvation, dying within the village's borders without ever seeing the world beyond. The pruning process was far from simple, and as he worked, he noticed a woman struggling to walk who stubbornly refused a seat in the carriage. Admiring her resolve over those who chose to ride, he checked on her well-being, only for her to admit her firm opposition to the relocation. He had anticipated finding the village in a much worse state. He assured her that this border village was a paradise, far superior to any city. She didn't fully understand the situation at first, but the reality of it became clear the moment they arrived. He gestured toward the walls, pointing out that they were entirely covered in flooring. The villagers welcomed them with a festive celebration and warm smiles, with Van joining in as well. Sensing their exhaustion, he organized a barbecue at their assigned quarters to help them bond and recharge. Spell, the village chief, expressed his sincere gratitude to Van for providing them with refuge. Van introduced himself and thanked Ortho for providing the meal, but Ortho modestly claimed he was only doing his job. Van then followed up by asking if the meat had been sourced from another monster. Van explained that 10 massive, malevolent boars had emerged late yesterday, recounting his panic at the sight, while Ortho warned that the creatures could use magic to paralyze anyone who approached them. However, a single blast had already taken them out, and shortly after, a young child from the neighboring village approached to ask for food. Van told him to wait, then instructed Till to fetch the soup and roast some small cuts of meat for him. Heaps of food were brought out and served to everyone present. The newcomers were overcome with joy, and some were even moved to tears as they ate. It had been a long time since he last tasted meat, and he made sure to savor every bite. Van and his villagers felt equally touched as they witnessed the group's genuine delight. Van felt a wave of relief, having finished the housing and barbecue preparations for 300 people just before their arrival. Although his crew, especially Pill, provided essential support, Van had shouldered the brunt of the work himself. His next task was to plan the outskirts for visiting adventurers, envisioning a small town that would serve as a rest stop for dungeon delvers. By establishing this hub outside the main village, he hoped to create a buffer that would keep any criminal activity or suspicious individuals away from the local residents. Van set an ambitious goal to finish the town within a month, leaving Ortholison stunned as he described a settlement for 400 people designed specifically to cater to travelers and adventurers. The layout featured tall residential buildings and 5 dedicated business structures, all situated within close proximity to one another. He reinforced the 100-meter walls by increasing the number of ballistae from 3 to 15, keeping them secured to prevent any misuse, while Asada suggested he prepare the town for the upcoming arrival of an Adventurers Guild branch. During their conversation, he questioned if Van planned to manage the shops and operations personally. Van explained that direct management would yield higher profits despite the extra effort, though Asada suggested appointing a representative since Van was already busy overseeing the village. With the town in need of oversight, a question arose about whether one person should manage every shop or if the shopkeepers could handle it themselves, leading Asada to suggest splitting the duties among several people. It was suggested that they could form a night army, leveraging Dee's support along with the necessary transportation and facilities. To ensure the town remained secure from potential thieves and troublemakers, Van decided to manage several shops personally, leaving Bell and Rango to handle the others, while he recruited adventurers for a nighttime security force. He extended an offer to share the duties of the representative role. While overseeing recruitment, Van questioned if a single army could defend both the village and the town. He felt confident in Dee leading the village's forces, while the newly formed unit would become the Aspa army. Asada quickly caught on and asked if this was meant as payback, while Van checked on the rest of the party to make sure no fights had broken out. Eric expressed his desire to accompany him. To avoid appearing disrespectful while consulting the villagers, Van offered her some meat to share as they talked. Till and Compion followed the group with visible excitement, observing them closely as they ate and walked. After noticing a shortage of seating, Van asked a sturdy villager to fetch 3 chairs, a task the man carried out with great enthusiasm. Van then recommended that he join the Seats Knight armor. While his plans were still in development, he urged the man to reconsider, feeling satisfied that he had secured a recruit before Estba as he turned his attention to scouting other warrior classes. The local villagers stepped forward, asking how they could be of assistance. Pleased with the additional help, Van assigned the group to work at the new stores and inns. Since they were skilled farmers but new to business, he reassured them that by handling customers and organizing stock, everyone would eventually find a role that suited them best. He gave his word that everyone would be compensated fairly. Observing the village's excellent condition, the old man questioned if he was in the right location until Van finally appeared. They never truly expected their life of smiles and joy to endure. Van remarked that this was only the beginning, promising that they would find joy in every day they spent together. Despite their initial focus on simple survival, the village continued to expand, drawing in a steady stream of new residents and travelers alike. With a grand gesture, he announced that the construction of another town was already underway. They soon recruited more villagers to assist, sending the strongest workers a kilometer away to begin constructing a new town for adventurers. Noticing the imbalance, SP directed the group to tug the rope toward the right. Van assigned the elderly newcomers to look after the cows since they were already experienced with the task, while the Agalis took charge of providing them with water and feed. The young newcomers were eager to settle into their new homes and explore the massive village walls alongside Seat's children. while Van felt a sense of satisfaction seeing his community finally grow. When a worker approached to ask about the lumber, Van requested another 100 logs by the end of the day, noting that D was already busy organizing a night squad. However, they had already officially signed up with SB. Van realized he had fallen behind, but fortunately, a few individuals had yet to commit. He quickly gathered them, planning to form a 20-man squad with Deed as the captain and Ab and Lou as vice-captains. Though the matter was minor, he reminded himself to stay calm and give Asada a moment to rest. Ken hurried in to report a horse and a medium-sized carriage approaching from the distance. It was Kusura, followed by several others, and Van thanked him while teasingly questioning how he could see that far. Till and Alti only managed to spot the woman standing beside Kusara once they had drawn closer. Realizing he had rescued her and won her heart, Alti was left in awe of Kusara's prowess, praising his agility, keen senses, and talent for disarming traps, alongside his mastery of the sword, archery, and throwing weapons. While the group was discussing Kusar, he arrived and playfully asked them to stop bad-mouthing him so loudly. Van feigned innocence as he welcomed him, inquiring about the woman by his side. Kusara explained that he had encountered her during his travels and, seeing she had nowhere else to go, decided to bring her along. Concerned about the village's rapid growth, Kusara asked if the increasing numbers were acceptable, but he was left speechless when Van revealed the population had already surged by 300. Till introduced herself to Van Tophilia, noting they shared the same name, and explained how Kusara had rescued her from an orc attack near the capital and brought her there, exactly as she had foreseen. Kusara tried to minimize the significance of the situation. Philly firmly insisted that he outshone any hero found in a storybook. Till and Altea were both buzzing with anticipation. He then noticed the group gathered behind Kusara. A group of adventurers gathered, each of them looking for their next quest. After reporting to this guild, Kusara apologized for the group of profit-seekers trailing him, though he suggested they camp outside to avoid alarming the villagers. Van wanted to earn their favor so they would spread positive word about the settlement. He asked them to wait, promising to provide basic defenses soon, then advised Kusara to rest in the village while he inquired about their next steps. Van explained that Ortha was currently scouting the dungeon, but since the difficult terrain prevented them from setting up camp, Kusara grinned and declared it was finally his time to shine. He decided to rest for the day and showcase his skills tomorrow, as Kuzar carefully weighed his current options. Philly bowed with an elegance that betrayed her noble upbringing before excusing herself. Alti quietly revealed her noble roots in the Stratus Viscount house, and when Van asked if she knew Philia, she explained that the girl's family had completely fallen apart after her father's passing, prompting a sympathetic Till to realize they were likely the same age. The group was stunned when Alti revealed that Filio was already in her 30s, leading Van to conclude that they should probably avoid asking women about their age from now on. Shifting his focus toward town development, he prioritized building temporary shelters and defensive walls while putting commercial shops on hold. His goal was to build a wall sturdy enough to hold back a medium-sized monster, buying the villagers enough time to retreat further into trouble hit. Mid-conversation, a group of adventurers approached and began to hassle them. After warning that the areas surrounding the village were still dangerous, the men dismissed them as brats and began flirting with Till and Alti, leaving Van stunned by their audacity. When asked if she was worried, Till admitted that while the group was strange, they seemed kind. Meanwhile, although Van found them intimidating, the others explained that the White Oath members were actually good-hearted despite their rough appearance. Van deduced that the D-Day crew referred to their party as White Oath. As the adventurers questioned the reason for their presence, Van reassured them that they would retreat to the village at the first sign of trouble. He received word from the guild about a wealthy young VIP who was leading a large group. Van found himself curious about the talented young noble, as he hadn't heard of them before. When an adventurer asked what he was doing, he simply explained he was waiting for a shipment of wood. He presented their meager supplies, which appeared quite worn and rugged. To ensure their safety throughout the night, they constructed a temporary fence. While the group stood in awe, Van mistook their silence for skepticism and assured them the structure would last a week, only for them to clarify that his magical ability was actually extraordinary. He arrived with 30 logs, and as his name was called out, the adventurers finally realized the boy was actually Van Fellow. Daggett Furious unsheathed his sword and challenged the loud-mouthed man to a duel. The situation was enough to leave even Van feeling rattled. This entity was known as the Adventurer's Egg Demon. Instead, he sliced their swords clean in half. He finished the job with a single decisive swing. His reputation as the most powerful dragon-slaying knight quickly spread across the land. After the anxious newcomers greeted him, Van warned them to stay out of trouble, feeling conflicted but hoping his sternness would maintain order. Van's natural leadership and youthful charm drew a crowd, and when they questioned his presence at the border, He admitted he had been cast out by his own family. Ortho arrived in the middle of their talk, clearly surprised by the large crowd. When Van asked when he had gotten back, Ortho explained that they had lingered at the dungeon longer than planned, but had finally returned. While he contemplated the number of nearby adventurers and Kusura's return, Van surprised the team by mentioning the beautiful woman he had brought with him. Kusura and Philia eventually arrived to check on the group after their delay, with Kusura explaining that since guild inspectors were due within the day, they would postpone their scouting mission until tomorrow. Philia called out to him, prompting him to introduce her to his fellow adventurers, while Kusura, who had initially wanted to help, saw them together and decided to head toward the goal instead. Ortho and the rest of the group were left in complete disbelief, questioning if everything they were seeing was just a dream. Van recounted how Kusura had saved her from an orc attack, and seeing him as a hero, she welcomed the group and even considered providing them with a small house nearby. Their envious reactions caused him to hesitate, as they clearly lamented missing out on the envy Kusura. After settling down, they inquired about the dungeon, and Periel explained that the creature remained inside, noting that the entrance was located in a particularly dangerous cliffside area of the forest. The group discovered a deep, narrow passage barely wide enough for 2 people, where stairs led down to a hall of pillars and glowing crystals, confirming it was indeed a dungeon. When Van asked about the distance, Periel noted it would take an hour by carriage and several more through the forest. Van was surprised, yet he understood that dungeons were typically remote, keeping the border's dangerous monsters far away from safe zones. He reasoned that no one would risk settling in such a dangerous location, though he still believed the nearby area held potential for a future village. Period warned that the dungeon's perimeter was teeming with massive monsters and treacherous terrain, making it impossible to establish anything more than a temporary camp. Van was struck by her sudden confidence as she insisted that this was the ideal location for him to build a base. Van argued that the force was far too volatile for his ballista to handle. Periel insisted on protecting him, claiming her team's extensive dungeon experience guaranteed their safety. But her forceful persistence only made the cautious Van more skeptical. He jokingly listed his conditions for the trip, demanding to be carried to the entrance, provided with naps and sweets, and allowed to bring Till, Kin, and Altia's servants along. Since Diana Sada would be busy managing the town, he also requested a substantial escort of guards for the journey. He expected her to hesitate, but she simply grinned and promised to have everything ready by the following day. Van was left in a state of shock as she informed Ortho that they would be taking him with them, telling him to get ready. The news was so shocking that even the servants listening in secret were left completely stunned. 3.5 hours had passed since they first departed from the village. He found himself bound to the dungeon with the task of establishing a base, a situation he had never once anticipated. He surveyed the landscape while Alti remarked on how refreshing the air felt. However, the constant jolting of the journey proved difficult to overlook. Rallying 50 adventurers, they set out for the dungeon aboard a lightweight shrine platform built by Van, though the rough ride threatened to toss them off at any moment. Once they cleared the forest, the path took them past caverns and cliffs where scattered corpses had simply become part of the scenery. As Van muttered about the unexpected turn of events, Kaman reminded him that he had already given his consent. Van struggled to maintain his composure while dealing with a bout of motion sickness. Despite the circumstances, the girls treated the entire journey like a fun road trip. They were awestruck by the distant mountains towering above the clouds, and the sight of a flying monster left them completely speechless. Van viewed the creature as a genuine threat, readying his crossbow in case it decided to swoop down. Startled by the mention of his name, he cautiously peeked out to see what was happening. He immediately ordered everyone to halt, clearly horrified by the flimsy 2-plank bridge ahead. While the group questioned why he was stopping so close to the dungeon, Van insisted they move the crossing to a wider location. The adventurers' blatant recklessness left them completely appalled. The heights were enough to make even a veteran steeplejack tremble, reminding him that true adventure rarely prioritizes safety. He ordered them to repair the hazardous area, warning that a single misstep could be fatal, and stressing the importance of proper risk management. The adventurers exchanged confused glances, seemingly unfamiliar with the concept, before he forced them all to their knees. They were forced to reconsider their strategy while struggling to understand the issue, eventually noticing Kusura hopping around and questioning his actions. He pondered the consequences of kicking the log with force, warning that even someone as agile as Kusura would plummet if the planks shifted or snapped. Van presented them with a choice: reinforce the bridge or find a safer route, then asked for their thoughts on how to handle the log. When someone suggested simply lining up more logs, Van forced them to kneel again and scolded them for their lack of common sense. He stood firm, maintaining that a solid bridge was the only proper solution. He insisted on ensuring the area was safe before crossing, which led the group to complain about their tight schedule. However, they quickly fell silent when Van threatened to abandon the base if the whining continued. They quickly set to work, but he remained focused on the dungeon entrance, noting that the narrow space between the cliffs and hills made it a poor spot for a base, which led Till to ask what was on his mind. Before he could provide an answer, a man interrupted to ask for his guidance on the essential facilities. Following Van's inquiry, the man suggested they visit a hostess club. After being rejected immediately, Van set about preparing the meal once more. Explaining the situation at the casino wasn't necessary, as it would have been a difficult point to prove anyway. He started by constructing a dungeon door and setting up a water system from the river, positioning his base on a nearby slope to ensure a seamless connection. Alti questioned if he was truly committed to the design, and he firmly assured her that he was. After utilizing 4 different abilities in rapid succession, the construction of the base was finally complete. After Van gave the word, the group filed inside to find a ground floor dedicated to storage and relaxation, a first floor with a canteen and 3 bedrooms, and 6 additional sleeping quarters spread across the upper levels. The structure was remarkably sturdy and well-balanced, featuring a versatile terrace that the adventurers could utilize however they saw fit, leaving them thoroughly impressed by the arrangement. Each level of the building was equipped with 4 separate toilets. He equipped the tanks with filtering nets to collect rainwater, though he cautioned that it still wasn't safe to drink. He handed the management responsibilities over to Ortho, asking him to lead the group effectively. Regarding the dungeon door, they debated whether to keep it closed or establish set hours, with Ortho suggesting they consult the various groups at the Dove that night. They agreed the chamber should remain sealed when empty to delay any threats from escaping, noting that its mithril-lined interior was strong enough to contain a forest dragon for an entire day. Steel bars reinforced the windows to keep monsters at bay, and while more openings would have brightened the room, he advised keeping them shut when they weren't needed. With the afternoon drawing to a close, Van decided it was time to head back and gave the order to have the escorts prepared. Startled by the sudden daylight, the adventurer hoped to squeeze in a nap, but Van quickly reminded him of his impending curfew. After witnessing that alongside you, I've decided to take my leave. They found it amusing to see the Lord so intimidated by his servant's anger, a clear reminder that he was still just a child despite his high-ranking title. Van Gotstern warned that they would miss dinner if they kept dawdling, but his threat only caused the group to laugh and tease him further. As they made their way back, they encountered another cliff. He couldn't comprehend how they managed to survive crossing such a lethal death trap. After constructing 2 more bridges, they finally emerged from the forest and arrived at the village just as the sun began to set. He then noticed a soda waiting there alongside Aspa. In a strange turn of events, it was the soda that wore a smile for once. Van was unsettled by his characteristic blank stare, prompting Asada to step in and request a private word. Terrified, Van pleaded for backup, yet the others were unable to even meet Asada's gaze. Till bravely decided to follow them, even though Kaman and Alti refused to go. He then lured Ortho into intervening, shifting the blame for the entire mess onto them. However, a silent assailant suddenly muffled him and dragged Van away. The lecture continued late into the night, finally concluding at midnight. The scene shifts to the outskirts of the capital, where a bustling slum market was teeming with activity. Lacking any talent for the 4 elements, the girl was instead relegated to a life of manual labor, singing and dancing. As more slabs were auctioned off, hunters in her position faced increasingly poor treatment. The market was abuzz with rumors of a man purchasing every available slab, leading some to dismiss him as a spoiled individual who intended to keep several of them as his mistresses. Instead, the entire group was traveling toward a secluded mountain to mine for life. She questioned whether she would ever find a sense of purpose, or if she was simply destined to meet her end there. At the same time, a caravan arrived at Seat Village, a town bustling with local adventurers. Rango eventually returned, leading a large crowd of people on horseback. He envisioned a warm and heartfelt reunion between the brothers. Belle interjected, asking Rango for the specific amount she had been sold for. Rango accounted for his 108 platinum coins, and, after careful planning, purchased 150 healthy slaves, all of whom were in their 20s or younger. Despite his surprise, he paid 3 platinum coins for each, totaling a massive sum in large gold coins. During the auction at Maria's guild, Rango's inquiry about carriages led the guild to apologize and slash prices by half to ensure their internal trading remained uncomplicated. Van greeted Ringo and remarked on the size of his group, though Ringo assured him that introductions would have to wait until later. He handed over the 130 platinum coins, fulfilling the terms of their prior agreement. Van expressed his gratitude and handed the items to Till, while Rango contributed 2 platinum coins as Van promised him a share of his future profits. Van expressed his appreciation, and in response, Rango promised to give him first priority on any monster materials he collected. Viewing the agreement as a win for both sides, Rango then revealed the unexpected news that Van had officially been appointed as a baron. This left him utterly stunned, as his father no longer held the authority to reclaim the territory or strip him of his title. Ken inquired whether Panama would be coming herself, but Rango explained that the Viscount would arrive shortly after delivering his report to the Count. Finding the prospect of developing this land far more enticing, she decided to align with Van instead of the Count's faction. Van hadn't anticipated her wanting to settle there, and while he liked her, the idea of her acting as his superior made the situation quite awkward. The scene shifted to the village square, where newcomers with remarkable skills were being interviewed. The group consisted of a former Viscount's daughter, an ex-knight, a knight's daughter, users of wind and earth magic, a former B-rank adventurer, the daughter of a fallen company director, and an ex-knight from an enemy nation. When questioned about their wind and earth magic, the blonde girl explained she could create mud walls, while the other was capable of defeating wolves and orcs with a single blow. The blonde girl from a merchant background explained that she had been managing sales and accounting since childhood. While the group was eager to hire her pending Van's approval, he couldn't help but wonder if her looks had influenced their decision. Bell proposed opening an armory at the entrance of Adventure Town Espa, believing it would be a successful venture for the blonde girl to manage, before the group moved on to meet a former noble child named Veda. He then asked Sheep whether they would prefer working at the inn, joining the knights, or serving in the Lord's lobby. Veda explained that she learned her trade from a kind maid named Till, and as she dedicated herself to her new duties, Van found her quite endearing. Her resemblance to Harem, a maid from his former home, prompted him to consider hiring her as a secretary, though he ultimately decided against the idea. Without warning, Vita suddenly sent an object flying. Having survived on meager rations for so long, this sudden act of kindness felt entirely foreign to him. She was completely stunned when Van offered to appoint them all as knights for the town. The notion of Slavs becoming knights was entirely unprecedented, and though Van acknowledged the surrounding area was crawling with dangerous monsters, he maintained that they could keep the villagers safe as long as they performed their duties effectively. Having never known a Slav to reach knighthood, Vita finally understood why the others were so energized. She found herself questioning the reason behind these unfolding events. Feeling relieved now that everyone's roles were settled, Van Lip watched as the knights knelt to pledge their service to him. He clarified that he had no intention of enslaving them, wanting them instead to integrate into the village and find a meaningful purpose to pursue. He encouraged them to join forces and give it their all. With tears welling in her eyes, Vita identified the objects as slabs. Despite the circumstances, he spoke as if a peaceful life were still possible, explaining that as the village lord, he considered every one of them his responsibility. They were supposed to watch over one another. At long last, Veda had finally discovered her true purpose in life. Regardless of the task, she was determined to give it her absolute best if it meant she could eventually return to this place. Van issued instructions for the builders and magic users to report to Asada, while the former knights, mercenaries, and adventurers were assigned to D. Following a sudden population boom, the village was now teeming with activity. They planned to construct a tavern to eventually employ bards, dancers, and musicians, while he recruited agricultural workers to manage the fields. Children under the age of 10 were tasked with assisting with the laundry, while also receiving their education. Following the Belgian Association's guidance, Newbie's business divided their carriages into 3 teams to expand their reach. As the groups headed toward the royal capital, Rango stayed behind. This was intended for the group of roughly 50 newcomers. Van planned to train the first knight squad as archers, teaching them how to master their powerful automatic crossbows. Veda, formerly a hunter known as Bora, mentioned her preference for the bow, prompting many others to question her choice. Van detailed his selection criteria, prioritizing experience and keen observation before finally choosing those with smaller frames who weren't suited for heavy armor. He was cautioned that bows were far from simple, as physically weaker children would likely struggle without sufficient arm strength. Intrigued by her insight, Van agreed selected the weakest-looking 11-year-old boy to test the light bow he had created. Passing it over to Bull, he instructed her to loosen her shoulders and focus her aim toward the forest. With her opening shot fired, she immediately moved in to keep the pressure on him. Turning toward the group, he invited everyone to give the new bow a try. Bora eagerly stepped forward to go first and was stunned by the item's quality, noting that it was powerful enough to fell a large-class monster. Van pointed out that they already possessed a ballista, rendering the bow unnecessary, but Bora's visible excitement at the news made him worry she might be a liability. Although he had planned to hire an experienced captain, he now found himself questioning if Bora was actually suitable for the role. To ensure their safety, he placed the team under Kaman's leadership, fully trusting him to handle the situation. Once that matter was resolved, he joined the group to focus on their research into crossbows. After finishing his work, he spent the rest of his time chatting away. While Alti considered ways to simplify the process for the users, she observed him quietly muttering to himself. She commented that he appeared to be genuinely enjoying himself. While the intricate mechanics and politics were demanding, Van agreed found the entire experience to be a total thrill. He found himself deeply impressed by the ingenuity of whoever first designed the crossbow. Finding the stick completely jammed, he suspected it required something elastic to finally move. He decided to test whether incorporating metal parts would offer any assistance. Taken aback, Alti muttered to herself about Van preparing the stakes, but she quickly blushed and apologized when she realized he had overheard her. Van laughed it off, openly admitting that he had made his fair share of mistakes. Although he took pride only in his magic, Alti disagreed, praising his swordsmanship and academic prowess as remarkable talents while confessing her own envy and perceived lack of skill. He then offered to connect her with a demonic executive and captain for training, so she could reach his level, a suggestion that inexplicably made her giggle. Driven by curiosity, he questioned her about the nature of the magic she wielded. Though the question seemed casual enough, she began to tremble with visible unease. Till noticed this as well, reassuring her that he wouldn't pressure her and that she could skip the task if it became too difficult. Alti insisted on providing the answer herself, revealing that she possessed the power of puppetry magic. Following a past incident, this ability became as dreaded as Kin's thievery and brainwashing magic, eventually being branded as a tool for cowardly sinners. Even with detection magic active, many still suspected that puppetry mages were behind the scenes, controlling the assassins like mindless pawns. Reflecting on his own ineffective magic, he finally understood her hesitation and asked what her abilities were capable of. Van hoped she would eventually feel comfortable sharing, as keeping it a secret forever would be a heavy burden. While Alti panicked and warned of the danger, Van remained supportive, wanting her to eventually take pride in it. She brought out a doll she had been keeping secret, though she remained hesitant to show it to him. Driven by her power, the doll rose to its feet. Van then inquired whether it was capable of movement. After she agreed, the creature began to dance, leaving Van stunned by its remarkably human-like precision and lack of wasted movement. Once the demonstration concluded, he took a moment to praise her for the remarkable potential she displayed. Till agreed, and as the group remained captivated by the magic, they asked if Alti danced as well. She admitted she could, but noted her true expertise was in puppeteering, which left Van surprised. This indicated that her mastery over the doll had actually surpassed the control she had over her own body. It was an impressive skill, allowing for the perfect direction of every movement with absolute precision. It was evident that Alti's magic possessed a dangerous potential for misuse. Her demeanor, however, suggested that she had never seen its power used for anything positive. Till came up with a clever plan to craft charming dolls for Alti to animate during festivals, bringing joy to all the villagers. Alti revealed that she was capable of moving dolls as large as herself. However, she had yet to attempt anything on a larger scale. Eager to test its capabilities, Van crafted a specialized doll for her, prompting her to ask why it was equipped with a sword and shield while wearing a dress. Van Grand explained that while it performed its dance perfectly in a dress, he had also equipped it with weapons for unforeseen emergencies. Constructed from mithril, the doll and its gear were exceptionally durable, prompting him to chuckle at how much they outclassed standard wooden or leather equipment. He realized that he would need to secure more mithril for his future doll-making projects. Once he finished, Alti surprised everyone by giggling for the first time. Thinking the shield might be responsible, Van offered to remove it, only to realize that wasn't the case at all. Till suggested swapping the item for an umbrella, and though Altea nodded in response, Till quickly clarified that she didn't have to go along with the idea. As their eyes met, Van and Alti broke into a shared laughter, marking the first time she had ever truly laughed from the heart. Following their heartfelt moment, they put the doll to the test, where Alti demonstrated such mastery that even the most minute movements were executed flawlessly. Dan turned toward her, intending to offer some well-deserved praise. He observed her gasping for air and clutching her chest as she struggled to keep her footing. He caught her and asked if she was all right, as she wheezed that the mithril doll had drained significantly more mana than she expected. Seeing her struggle, they laid her down and provided her with some water to help her recover. Unaware of his own mana limits, Van was caught off guard by the sudden drain, suspecting the mithril was the cause and resolving to lower its energy requirements. The week actually felt much more uplifting, all thanks to Van and Till. After a lifetime of feeling insignificant, she was finally determined to find her true purpose. He finally let out a smile, appearing visibly relieved. He proposed they study her magic together, certain that their collaboration would finally reveal its true potential. Alti's beaming face made her happiness perfectly clear. Without needing to force a smile, they eventually transitioned to using wooden block dolls to present to the local villagers. He then inquired if she was prepared to move them. She agreed, noting that the wooden dolls felt as light as paper compared to mithril. They required little effort to manage, and Van pointed out that using metal instead might only hinder mana flow. He observed that the effectiveness of her magic was directly tied to the person wielding it. At 10 years old, Alt-E was beginning to grasp the reality of her situation, suggesting she was finally starting to accept herself. She remained on standby, waiting for his signal to begin. Van introduced Miss Alti's performance of the Seat Village mascot doll dance. The villagers stared in disbelief as it began to move with uncanny, lifelike precision. Several observers identified the puppetry magic, noting its notorious connection to professional assassinations. Van urged them to hold their judgment, as the doll's performance was unlike any dance they had ever witnessed. Empowered by Van Prey's ability, her confidence surged as she began controlling the dolls with the precision of a master. A profound silence washed over the villagers as they finished admiring the wooden doll's graceful movements. As the dance concluded, Alti turned to meet the group's stunned expressions. The performance earned a thunderous ovation, with the crowd praising the stunning choreography as the most beautiful dance they'd ever witnessed, while the children eagerly called for an encore. Witnessing the true extent of her own magic caused her to finally recognize Van's brilliance. There was a time when she dreaded her own power, believing it to be something dark and sinister. Now, as he basked in the praise, tears began to well in his eyes. She rushed toward Van, weeping as she threw her arms around him. His encouragement sparked a newfound hope that she might finally learn to embrace her magic. He returned her embrace and suggested that she should also perform during dinner. He made a promise to live a more joyful life from that point forward. He made it his personal mission to see Alti smile more often, going so far as to build her a stage and dress the dolls in her favorite outfits just to brighten her mood. And so, the night drew to a close with everyone in high spirits. Meanwhile, a man arrived on the scene, appearing visibly thrilled as he focused his attention on the van. He was left completely drained by the toll of constant overwork. While sitting for tea with Alti, she questioned Vance on whether he might ever collapse from overusing his mana. Altha began to wonder if her own mana was insufficient, but she was soon advised not to compare her abilities to Van's. Since mana remained invisible, those with elemental affinities relied on practical tests, such as tracking the number of high-tier spells cast or measuring how long they could sustain basic magic. While many could use all 4 elements, they were typically limited to low-level magic, as mastering high-tier spells like those of Panamera or Asada was rare. However, Van cast high-level magic for hours on end, a feat Alti found completely unheard of. He brushed it off, claiming that a single powerful spell had left him exhausted. Yet, despite his unknown mana capacity, his performance in the village had been truly remarkable. The task he performed was so grueling that even the world's most powerful mage would have collapsed after only 2 hours. Considering the constant chatter, Van anticipated that the others would be caught completely off guard. Seta calmly pointed out that they had already reached that state every single time. The story shifts back 1 month to the events unfolding in the capital. The king entrusted First Prince Celio with the responsibility of governing the nation for a period of 3 months. Chilio questioned if the situation involved the new baron, and offered to send a scout for confirmation, all while wondering why Prime Minister Apila Tadu was joining the effort. Apila was determined not to let the king enjoy an excursion on his own, reasoning that if he was forced to stay in the capital, the monarch should be as well. Despite this, the king remained firm, insisting that his involvement had nothing to do with his own interests. He usually summoned others to his side, but since this village lord likely couldn't travel, he decided to go personally, while Shilio offered to lead the scouts due to the growing unrest in neighboring countries. Ready to strike at any moment, they were likely evaluating the border lords and other influential figures, such as powerful nobles, elite squads, or mages. To them, a village of only 100 people slaying a dragon signaled a leader worth meeting in person, like Celio. Inheriting his father's sharp wit, the handsome and popular young man showed every sign of becoming a great lord if given the right guidance. His overwhelming desire for peace meant he never even considered the possibility of a clash with his rivals. While peace was the ultimate goal, the sight of neighboring nations expanding their militaries convinced the king that any hesitation would be fatal, and only true strength could safeguard his realm. The king realized that Pista was actually the same age as the new lord. Pista's passions were limited to swords and horses rather than politics, so the lord brought him along, believing the experience would provide a much-needed lesson. Looking at Chilio, the king reflected on the exhausting responsibilities he had shouldered when he was the same age. He viewed the next 3 months as a necessary reality check for the young man. With that, he encouraged Chilio to do his absolute best in his new role as acting king. As they left the capital, the king found himself reminiscing about his youth, a time when he could travel freely without the heavy preparations of royalty. However, because the escort ships were too conspicuous to hide, They were unable to blend in and observe the lives of commoners as they passed by. Upon seeing the royal crest, the crowd immediately pressed their faces to the dirt, while those who resisted were quickly forced back down. Though the logic was sound, the king found it all quite tedious. He refused to rule through fear to preserve his authority, and while these methods helped expose traitors and maintain order, he remained bored and fixated on the mystery of how a small village had managed to slay a dragon. Pista calls them over to look, and they are immediately struck by the sheer scale of Seat Village's massive walls. Apella was amazed by the rapid progress, noting that the structures should have still been nothing more than simple shacks. Amused by Apella's blunt curiosity, the king asked for clarification and agreed to visit the fort, eager to discover the secrets hidden within. The village was far more vibrant than the fort, with Alti's dancing dolls drawing enthusiastic applause from the crowd. Watching the children play with her creations filled her with joy, and though she still required some assistance, the success motivated her to practice every day and refine her delicate control. Van was relieved that the villagers chose to embrace the situation rather than fear it. Word soon arrived of an ornate carriage's approach, its grandeur clearly visible from the vantage point of the fort. Arthur suspected the official was there to verify the dragon's subjugation, while Piril and Kusura speculated it might involve promotion papers or dungeon business. With Van's new title as Baron, the villagers were already buzzing with the hope of another celebratory barbecue. Overhearing their excitement, Van promised a nighttime feast, prompting the locals to begin prepping the grills with renewed enthusiasm. Although it was ahead of schedule, he decided to let it slide. After surviving on nothing but fruits and vegetables, he finally spotted the royal crest on the carriage and suggested they assemble everyone. As night descended, the mechanical crossbow team moved into their designated positions within the village. Their ranks had grown to include more than 100 members. Their gear was designed for maximum versatility, utilizing a blend of wood and iron that included iron shields, mithril swords, and long spears to ensure they were prepared for any situation. Ben approached the official with a sense of confidence and excitement, clearly eager to offer his assistance. Upon opening the gate, the newly appointed Baron Van was stunned to find Panamera standing right before him. He struck him with a powerful blow. She teased him for his underwhelming reaction, jokingly questioning if he had found another woman. A stunned Van stammered mentioned how close he'd grown to Alti, who then hurried over to give Panamera a warm greeting. They bombarded her with questions about her various travels. Struck by the sudden radiance in Alti's expression, Panamera questioned Van about what had transpired, jokingly asking if he had used brainwashing magic on her. Van explained that Alti had lost confidence in her abilities, so he took it upon himself to show her the true potential of her magic. Panema's expression turned solemn as she listened to Alti explain the nature of her magic. She playfully pinched everyone's cheeks, clearly delighted by the experience. He laughed and dubbed Van the Charmer, deciding to save the amusement for another time. She instructed him to bow, reminding him to show the proper respect a baron owes to his majesty. He froze in place, his tension peaking as King Danim approached, stunned to see the monarch so far from the royal capital. Confirming the reality of the moment, King Dano of Shura formally welcomed Van into the nobility, expressing his high expectations for how Van's unique knowledge and power would drive the kingdom's prosperity. As Van knelt, he privately questioned the king's presence and leadership ability, while Dino revealed he knew about the dungeon discovery and informed him that a guild investment squad would soon arrive for a full briefing. Knowing the report would inevitably reach him, lying was out of the question, so he openly praised Van's subjugation of the forest dragon during the auction. He remarked that a knight should have been sent in his place, but the strange nature of the reports required his personal investigation and a thorough questioning of Van. When asked if he had any objections, Van lifted his head and resolved to answer with complete honesty. However, they insisted on securing a firm promise from the king. Taken aback by the sudden objection and Van's composed demeanor, the king gave him his full attention. Van offered to disclose everything, but knowing how far-fetched it sounded, he asked the king to promise he would try to believe him. Meanwhile, Apella snickered as the king voiced his sheer astonishment. He then agreed to make a sincere effort to believe Van's account.